Okay. So the plan will be, we'll try to send it out after the meeting and see if we get any comments. How's that? Do you think it's necessary to revise the ISA summary too?
Well, when we have the discussion, if there's anything you think that, or the panel thinks should be revised, we should address that, but we don't have we're not revisiting anything else other than the PA Chapter 5 discussion.
Yeah, I read over everybody's comment and I felt some of the issues probably should have been mentioned in the ISA. Then we can follow up on the, I'll point that out.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, so I can make some revision on that. Then it kind of flowed to the PA discussion summary.
Yeah.
So that's why I'll point out. Yeah, I revisit everybody's comments and I felt need to add something for the summary too, for the
Okay.
PA. You had a question, right, for the PA, for the ISA too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
only one question on that.
So we can come back to that when the meeting starts, and I suppose since it's 8 o'clock, is everyone here, Aaron, or are we still waiting for a few people to join?
A few, but I think we can go ahead and get started with critical mass here. Okay, good morning. I'm Aaron Yao. I'm the designated federal officer for the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. In my role as DFO, I'd like to formally open this public meeting. The CASAC is an independent expert federal advisory committee chartered under the authority of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. The CASAC is empowered under the Clean Air Act to provide independent advice to the EPA administrator on the scientific and technical bases for EPA's National Ambient Air Quality Standards. FACA and EPA policy require that CASAC meetings be announced to the public in the Federal Register, and that substantive deliberations and interactions with EPA and the public be conducted in open sessions where a DFO is present to ensure the requirements of FACA are met. FACA also requires that public meetings provide an opportunity for public comment. There is a public comment period noted on the agenda where members of the public have registered in advance with the SAB staff office to make oral comments. Written public comments have also been received and were distributed to the CASAC and posted on the meeting webpage. Minutes will be prepared to summarize discussion and action items in accordance with the requirements of FACA. I will work with the chair to certify the minutes and have them posted on the CASAC website. The CASAC consists of special government employees appointed by EPA to their positions. As government employees, the members are subject to all applicable ethics laws and implementing regulations. The SAB staff office has determined that advisors participating in this meeting have no financial conflicts of interest or appearance of a loss of impartiality under federal ethics regulations. relating to the topic of this meeting. For those on the phone, I'd like to note that we have a live video webcast of this meeting. To access it, go to casac.epa.gov, then click on today's meeting and you will see the link to the live video webcast. To those watching the live video webcast, please send me an email indicating your attendance. If you have previously requested a call-in number, you do not need to email me again. I would now like to turn the meeting over to Dr. Leanne Shepard, Chair of the CASAC.
Welcome, everyone, and good morning. Welcome to this final set of CASAC PM panel review meetings. Our goal today and in the meetings next week is to reach consensus on our draft reports. In reviewing the agenda, we will start with remarks from EPA and public speakers, and then we will move to the draft CASAC ISA supplement report. We will start by reviewing the consensus responses, followed by our review of the letter to the administrator. And then I will pause and ask the chartered CASAC members only to provide their disposition of the ISA supplement report as amended during our discussion. Overall, this meeting will follow a rolling agenda. The one exception is the topic listed at 2 p.m. Eastern. Unless we have the opportunity to start this discussion early, at this time we will have further deliberation of the draft PA charge questions for Chapter 5 of the policy assessment, reconsideration of the secondary standard. This discussion will be led by Dr. Chow with additional input from discussants Allen, Boylan, Panette, Gonzalez, and Turpin before we open up the discussion to the full panel. If this discussion is completed before 3 p.m. Eastern, we will return to our review of the CASAC draft reports. So during the meeting, I'll call brief breaks as needed. And now I'll turn the meeting over to EPA if they wish to make any remarks.
Great, thank you, Dr. Shepard. I'm going to get us started out here. Steve Dutton, I am Director of the Health and Environmental Effects Assessment Division in the Office of Research and Development's Center for Public Health and Environmental Assessment. And I'd like to first thank the PM CASAC panel for the thorough review and very helpful comments and recommendations provided so far in the draft letters that are being discussed today and next week. My staff in the Office of Research and Development produced both the 2019 particulate matter integrated science assessment, as well as the draft supplement to the PM ISA that you're currently reviewing. Your comments and advice on the draft supplement are instrumental in ensuring that we establish a thorough and up-to-date scientific record to aid in reconsideration of the PM National Ambient Air Quality Standards. It was just about 9 months ago, EPA announced it will reconsider the 2020 decision to retain the PM NACs. And as part of that reconsideration process, the supplement to the PM ISA is being produced to thoroughly evaluate the most up-to-date policy relevant science and that has become available after the literature cutoff date of the 2019 ISA. That could either further inform the adequacy of the current PM NACs or address key scientific topics that have evolved since the 2020 PM NACs review was completed. So given the supplement will be used in conjunction with the existing 2019 ISA as the combined scientific record for this review, I think it's helpful for the panel to recognize our desire in some instances to keep some organization and presentation of information, as well as some terminology consistent between those two documents. For instance, we've made an effort in both documents to incorporate a more integrative and streamlined discussion in the main body of the text and relegate a lot of the study-specific details to the appendices and process details to the standalone preamble to the ISA, which you also have available to you. That said, we're continuously improving the ISA, and any general comments that you have that could be useful for us in developing future ISAs are also welcome. In the letter, it's been very helpful when the CASAC has delineated such advice on the ISA program as a whole from the more specific advice that we should take into consideration as we revise this draft supplement that's currently under review. And generally, we really appreciate the effort you've made in the draft letter to provide very precise language. That's much appreciated. I will be on the call today, as will Jason Sachs, who is the lead for the 2019 PM ISA, as well as the draft supplement that you're reviewing, to help answer any questions or clarify any issues that come up on the draft supplement. We also have others available on the call or listening in on the live stream to help if needed. This has taken a tremendous amount of effort to get to this point in such a short amount of time. And I'll just close by recognizing the dedication of the entire team at EPA who's working on both the draft supplement to the PM ISA, which is developed in my division with the Office of Research and Development, as well as the draft policy assessment, which is developed in Dr. Erika Sasser's division in the Office of Air and Radiation. So I will, on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Erika for a few remarks on the policy assessment.
Thanks very much, Steve. Want to start again by reiterating Steve's thanks to the CASAC, to Dr. Shepard for her leadership of the CASAC, and also to all the members of the PM panel. We are very grateful for the amount of time and effort that you are putting into this process, and we really appreciate all of the careful thought and that's reflected in the draft letter. As Steve said, I'm Erika Sasser. I am the director of the Health and Environmental Impacts Division in EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. And so my staff is responsible for the policy assessment and the risk analyses that are encompassed in that document. And we are also available today during the call if you have questions about specific aspects of the policy assessment or the quantitative risk analyses. We hope that you will ask our experts who are available to you today. And we thank you very much again for your time. And I will, with that, turn it back over to Erin, I believe.
Before we go on, I wanted to ask maybe Steve and probably Erika as well. Steve, you made the point about the consistency of the language across the documents. And there were a couple of places where I wanted to check probably today to make sure that our advice is consistent with that effort on your part. And so if there's anything you want to identify now that, or if you want to bring it up later and try to help me make sure that I address it, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. We could actually, it might be helpful. There's a couple of points we could raise, and I know I have Jason Sachs on as well. In general, some very helpful communication and suggestions on our language around, populations of color and communities of color versus white and non-white, and that's we're definitely evolving that language. Part of the challenge there with making that change at this point in the supplement is that then we would be using different terms between the supplement and the ISA, which I know could become very confusing. But this is certainly something we're discussing with EPA more broadly to incorporate into future reviews. So certainly appreciate those suggestions, and those will be taken into consideration to improve documents in the future for sure. I don't know, Jason, did you want to comment at all, if you're available, on statistical significance? I know that was another term that came up.
Yeah, throughout the ISAs for probably the last, I guess, 15 or so years that I've been involved with them, we've not explicitly made comments regarding statistical significance of results, but we've presented confidence intervals, and more so out of different things that have evolved over time, where with journals not focusing so much on p-values and statistical significance, and us really focusing on what is the body of evidence telling us, what's the pattern of associations versus solely statistical significance. And so we've really strived both in making revisions to the comments you all provided to ensure that we're providing at least the confidence intervals around the estimates versus making strong statements about statistical significance in general.
Thank you. Well, if anything else comes up during the day, please raise your hand or let me know that if there's something that we need to be attuned to with respect to this issue of lining up the 2019 ISA with the supplement.
Great, thank you.
Stephanie?
I just wanted to comment on that last comment about the language regarding people of color versus, white, non-white. And I wonder if there's an opportunity to add a clarification early on in the supplement to describe that, the terminology might be inconsistent with the previous draft ISA, but that this is, this is an evolving process and just clearly explain it early on.
You want to go, Steve? You want me to say something?
And we can actually elaborate on that a little more. Go ahead, Jason. We have actually already started some changes there.
Yeah, we've been making changes along those lines. Part of the discussions we've been having is trying to find out what's the terminology the agency is using more broadly around whether it's populations of color, whether it's minority populations, just to make sure that we're being consistent with how the agency more broadly is characterizing populations. And then what we're also doing is clearly defining that this is how the study defined this group, recognizing that in many studies they say non-white, and we know that that's not the correct terminology to use, but also defining what populations and ethnic, or what races and ethnicities they're encompassing within that categorization. So it's clear what the study conveys, so that if someone goes back to the study, they can see, oh, what they did within here is they presented results for non-white, and this is how they define them, even though that's not necessarily the terminology we will convey throughout the document.
Okay, and I think we better move on and turn the meeting back over to Aaron to invite the public speakers to make their comments.
Okay, yes, so we will have our public comment period. And again, I'll just read the ground rules for the public comment period. You'll be limited to 3 minutes to make your oral statement. There will be a visible and audible 3-minute timer to help keep the time. Once the timer goes off, you can finish your sentence, but then we'll have to ask you to stop. To make the best use of time, please focus your oral comments on the documents under review. Other comments can be included in the written comments and referenced to in the oral statement. Input from the public to the CASAC panel will have the most impact if it provides specific scientific technical information or analyses for the CASAC panel to consider, or if it relates to the clarity or accuracy of the technical information. Then lastly, please remain professional and civil, refraining from any personal attacks. Okay, so we will go ahead and get started with the first public commenter, who will be James Enstrom.
Hello. I have 50 years of experience in conducting epidemiologic cohort studies, and I've published important peer-reviewed PM 2.5 death findings based on ACS CPS 1 and CPS 2 cohort data. The February 4 PM panel letters do not address the detailed public criticism of the 2021 PM ISA supplement and PM PA. The EPA staff has made no changes in these documents in response to this criticism. In particular, they ignored Richard Smith's evidence of no PM 2.5 deaths below 12 micrograms per cubic meter and my 36 pages of evidence that PM 2.5 does not cause premature deaths in the United States. The recommendations of the PM panel and EPA staff to tighten the PM 2.5 NAAQS are based on a deliberately falsified research record regarding PM 2.5 related deaths. Falsification is serious scientific misconduct as defined in the January 11 White House OSTP Scientific Integrity Task Force report. Thus, I request that Jennifer Peel, with a PhD in epidemiology, confirm that the PMPA is a robust and comprehensive evaluation of the epidemiologic literature, and that public comments like mine do not alter her evaluation. There is no scientific or public health justification for tightening the PM 2.5 NAAQS because there is no etiologic mechanism by which inhaling about 100 micrograms of PM 2.5 per day can cause death. And the US already has a very low average PM 2.5 level of 7 micrograms per cubic meter, whereas our competitor China has a very high level of 48. Indeed, there are adverse public health, welfare, social, economic, and energy effects associated with tightening the PM 2.5 NAAQS. This tightening will hurt America at a time when it is facing military and economic dangers from Russia and China, as well as rapidly increasing energy costs. Finally, I strongly support the ongoing Young and Cox versus EPA lawsuit because the Biden CASAC and its PM 2.5 panel are illegally constituted and in gross violation of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. The current misguided effort to tighten the PM 2.5 NAAQS must be stopped. Thank you.
Okay, any questions from the panel? Okay, hearing none, our next speaker will be Ronald Stein with PTS Advance. Ron, are you on? Ronald Stein? Okay, we will circle back to him at the end. We'll go on to the next speaker, Jay Lair with Committee for Constructive Tomorrow. Jay, are you on? I think I saw Lair's iPad. Is that you, Jay? Are you on? If you are muted. Okay, we'll go on to the next speaker, Albert Rizzo with the American Lung Association.
Morning. Thank you for this opportunity to provide comments from the American Lung Association. I'm Dr. Albert Rizzo, the Chief Medical Officer for the American Lung Association, and I will share a summary of our comments today, which we also submit in detail in writing. The American Lung Association has a long-standing commitment to the principles of the Clean Air Act, including the requirement for setting national ambient air quality standards for criteria pollutants at levels that protect the health of all communities and sensitive groups based on current science. These standards must also include a margin of safety to account for scientific uncertainties, technological shortcomings, as yet unidentified health hazards, and the cumulative impacts of other risks, such as those from climate change. We strongly agree with the majority of the CASAC members in their draft recommendations to strengthen both the long-term and short-term standards. Science has clearly shown that particles of all sizes are harmful to health when inhaled. They cause or exacerbate a wide range of pulmonary, cardiovascular, and neurological illnesses. Recent large studies show that long-term exposure to particle pollution, even at low levels, can be deadly. Based on the overwhelming scientific evidence, we support setting an annual standard of 8 micrograms per cubic meter and a 24-hour standard of 25 micrograms per cubic meter for the primary standard to best safeguard human health and well-being. Both values are at the lower end of the ranges recommended by the majority of the CASAC PM panel and also better align with the guidelines of the World Health Organization. Since the EPA uses the 24-hour standard to inform its air quality index, a protective standard will better inform the public about unhealthy levels of pollution in their communities. We further strongly urge that CASAC recommend revising the form of the short-term standard to 99th percentile to effectively capture acute short-term exposures. The current form at 98th percentile dates to 1997 and allows for nearly 22 days in the 3-year review period to exceed the standard limit, in addition to days exempted for exceptional events such as wildfires. In conclusion, we urge EPA to seize this opportunity to strengthen PM 2.5 standards to the most stringent levels recommended by the majority in CASAC. Scientific research to date is unequivocal and unambiguous about the connection between exposure to physically and chemically diverse fine particle pollution and various morbidities and mortality. Therefore, revision of PM 2.5 standards are necessary and urgent to alleviate disease and suffering and prevent avoidable deaths. Such standards are effective only if they are set at levels that afford equal protection to all demographics of the U.S. population. Strengthening PM 2.5 standards would also offer additional benefit from reduction in multiple PM precursor pollutants. We therefore urge the agency to exceptionally adopt an annual standard of 8 micrograms per cubic meter and 24-hour standard of 25 micrograms per cubic meter set at the 99th percentile averaged over 3 years in accordance with the current standards. Thank you for serious consideration of these comments.
Okay, thank you. Does the panel have any questions? Okay, we will move on to the next speaker. Our next speaker will be Allison Lee with the American Thoracic Society.
Dear CASAC committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm a pulmonary and critical care physician and associate professor of medicine at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine. I am vice chair of the Environmental Health Policy Committee of the American Thoracic Society, or ATS. I'm speaking today on behalf of the ATS and wish to emphasize the following points. There's clear evidence of serious health effects, including death, at PM 2.5 exposures below the current annual and 24-hour standards for PM. The ATS recommends lowering the annual standard to 8 micrograms per meter cubed. Further, the ATS recommends lowering the 24-hour standard to 25 micrograms per meter cubed. With regards to the annual standard, there's clear evidence that the current annual standard is not protective. For example, Dominici et al. In 2019 demonstrated positive associations between all-cause mortality and PM 2.5 at low concentrations, including below the US PM NACS annual standard. In 2017, DAL found linear associations between mean PM 2.5 levels and mortality, as low as 6 micrograms per meter cubed. Susceptible groups are particularly affected, and the ATS notes that the mandate of the EPA is to protect public health with an adequate margin of safety. Therefore, the ATS recommends revising the annual PM 2.5 standard to 8 micrograms per meter cubed. With regards to the 24-hour standard, there is clear evidence that the current 24-hour standard is not protective. Studies consistently demonstrate a linear relationship between short-term PM 2.5 and mortality, stroke, and hospital admission without evidence of a threshold. Susceptible groups, including persons of color, the elderly, and Medicaid-eligible persons, are particularly effective. Further, the ATS notes that while air pollution concentrations have declined across the United States, communities of color and indigenous communities have been left behind and remain disproportionately exposed. The ATS emphasizes that lowering the 24-hour standard will be particularly beneficial for the health of these communities. Further, a more protective 24-hour standard will help develop a policy response to exposure hotspots. Based on this, as we did in 2012, the ATS recommends lowering the 24-hour PM 2.5 standard to 25 micrograms per meter cubed. We urge CASAC in advising EPA about the PM standard to consider the recommendations of the ATS, whose mission is to protect the respiratory health of all children and adults. Thank you.
Okay, does the panel have any questions? Okay, we'll go on to our next speaker, who will be Amir Miraban.
Good morning. My name is Amir Miraban. It is evident that the EPA is focused entirely on doing more damage than it already has done regarding PM 2.5 NOx regulations. How is it that inhaling 100 micrograms of PM 2.5 per day can lead to death when hundreds and thousands of people, for example, who smoke cigarettes, inhale much more PM 2.5 yet still continue to have average lifespans? Make no mistake, relying on falsified and exaggerated data lead to devastating consequences, specifically to average middle-class Americans such as myself. It does not take doctorate-level experience to discover that PM 2.5 has no correlation whatsoever to human mortality. If this matter was given to a high school graduate, they could smell lies just as well. The mounting evidence that derives from Dockery 1993 and Pope 1995 is nothing but deliberate propaganda. There were no in vivo experiments done on humans nor animals, which raises significant questions about the EPA's academic intelligence. In fact, most of the recent US evidence on PM 2.5 deaths comes from Medicare records of up to 69 million recipients. Medicare records, by definition, people who have Medicare are people who are older, have more comorbidities, that are weaker, and generally they have comorbid lifestyles. Not to mention that using Medicare records for the sake of science violates basic ethical and epidemiological principles. This evidence was proven by Enstrom 2017 and his independent CPS2 reanalysis, along with 60 other PM2.5 NOx critics of this bizarre claim. It is no wonder that there is no correlation between inhaling PM2.5 and death, since the evidence arguing so is incredibly pathetic. There needs to be equal representation within the CASAC panel. We're a republic and we are a representative democracy. Choosing people to ruin and choosing people to prosper will not get you anywhere. Recent local elections show that grassroots voters are becoming suspicious of systematic, dogmatic governmental agencies and entrenched scientific dogmatism. Rest assured, they are being heard at the ballot boxes. Blue-collar workers like truckers, farmers, and landscapers are living paycheck to paycheck with the equipment and money they have. We're in a period of high inflation and military conflict, and Americans are not ready to give up their liberties for EPA's pockets to be filled. The Biden administration's EPA needs to stop hurting Americans, of which many have already lost their businesses with the already tightened PM2.5 NOx regulations. If this panel gives any care in the world, it would behoove them to reevaluate their claims. Thank you.
Okay, any questions from the panel? Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to our next speaker, Gilbert Benitez.
Good morning.
Yes, go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Gilbert Benitez, and thank you for this opportunity. I am a Los Angeles general contractor, and the carbs diesel truck regulations due to the EPA PM 2.5 NAAQS have adversely affected me as a small business owner and as an ex-employee of a ready-mix company that went out of business. I owned a small truck disposal company and was forced to get rid of my Mack roll-off truck because it didn't meet the strict carb diesel PM regulations. I suffered a financial burden and lost clients who depended on me for their projects. The stress put on me and my family was insurmountable. When your livelihood gets taken away and you do not have a plan B, you could just imagine the toll it took on me and my family. I couldn't afford a new truck, so I decided to close my business. I then decided to work for a ready-mix company as a driver. I spent almost 10 years with the company and was climbing up the ranks when the EPA started cracking down on the ready-mix company's operations and the diesel exhaust regulations. The company started upgrading their plants, but ended up closing because the EPA diesel PM regulations were not being met. The company spent millions on purchasing new trucks to update their fleet, and then they spent hundreds of thousands on changing the exhaust filters on all the new trucks they just purchased because the trucks still did not meet the strict EPA regulations. Not only after changing the exhaust filters, they were given a deadline to turn in the new trucks with the new exhaust filters for the trucks and had to meet the new EPA regulations. So when the time came to turn in the trucks, the ready-mix company decided to go out of business and auction all their new trucks that were no longer compliant with the new emission regulations in California and laid off all the employees. When the company announced they were going out of business, it alters people's lives forever. A lot of drivers took early retirement because they did not want to start at the bottom with another company. There were some drivers that started working with the company before I was born and had to look for other means to provide for their families after being a driver for 30 plus years. EPA needs to be more sensitive and realistic regulations that will not destroy people's lives and their livelihoods. The EPA should certainly not tie in the existing strict PM 2.5 NAAQS. Thank you for your time on this sensitive matter.
Okay, any questions from the panel? Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to our next speaker, Jacob Kohlhepp.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm a PhD candidate in economics at UCLA, As part of my studies in the course of my own research, I've been trained in causal inference, which is the process of determining the actual effect of one piece of a system on another. This is necessary because in economics, just like epidemiology, randomized controlled trials are often unethical or not feasible. This makes me qualified to comment on some aspects of the discussion at hand. Like any proposed policy, making particulate matter standards more strict will have both costs and benefits. While the costs seem quite apparent, the benefits are clouded by issues of causality, intentional omission of key studies from the literature, and data transparency problems. From an economic standpoint, the costs of increasing particulate matter standards are straightforward. The industries which emit such matter will need to increase costs to comply. This places a particularly large burden on smaller businesses, like independent truckers, and is likely to favor larger corporations which can use their large size to economize on compliance costs. Beyond this, these regulations apply most directly to industries which employ large numbers of blue-collar Americans. To the extent that these regulations increase marginal costs, economic theory suggests the impacted industries should reduce employment. And as we just saw, this isn't some sort of theoretical regularity, right? This is something that actually happens, as the last speaker mentioned. While the costs are clear, the benefits are certainly not. One of the primary benefits cited by supporters of more stringent standards are improvements in human health. However, all of these claims rest crucially on whether particulate matter causes adverse health outcomes. The EPA seems to be aware that causality is important because the word causal appears 332 times in the 2021 draft of the supplement. But is there causal evidence that PM 2.5 causes adverse health outcomes? For now, let's focus on the worst outcome, death. Based on the 2021 supplement, the bulk of studies use variations of a straightforward design. They compare deaths and PM 2.5 levels across geographic units. From the outset, any person interested in causality should be skeptical. Why? Because places and times with high levels of particulate matter are fundamentally different from places and times with low levels of particulate matter. As an example, it is well known that poor neighborhoods are often exposed to higher levels of pollutants. Because poverty can cause adverse health outcomes through pathways other than pollution, this induces a bias in any estimated effect. Even studies that are able to control for granular enough demographic data will never be able to account for the potentially unobserved differences across places. To put it simply, even if we control for every demographic difference across Kansas and California, there is still something unobservably different about the people living in the two places. In conclusion, I'd like to ask that the EPA take time to investigate additional causal studies. The report and supplement make some inroads in this regard, but more work must be done to make sure there's a causal relationship before we can move on in adjusting the standards. Thank you.
Okay, any questions from the panel? Okay, we'll move on to our next speaker. Michael Lewis with the Construction Industry Air Quality Coalition in California.
Good morning. My name is Michael Lewis, and I'm the Senior Vice President of the Construction Industry Air Quality Coalition, a business advocacy organization composed of the largest construction associations in California. We represent a combined membership of 3,000 contractors employing over 400,000 well-paid construction workers. We've engaged with local and state regulators for over 30 years on matters affecting our companies and their employees. The issue of PM 2.5 is of great interest to our members because we operate large diesel, off-road, portable, on-road, and other equipment that produces PM 2.5. In California, we have some of the strictest PM 2.5 regulations in the nation. Today, our fleet of equipment is the cleanest in the world, and in the next 5 years, as we achieve the final fleet averages, we will be even cleaner. It has cost our industry billions of dollars to reach this point, and we are gravely concerned about your effort to move the goalposts arbitrarily and cause the expenditure of even more billions with little health improvement to show for it. If you look at mortality, and the exception of one other state, California is the healthiest state in the union. If you just look at California, Southern California is healthier than Northern California. This defies the popular narrative that the area with the worst man-made PM pollution is also the unhealthiest. In fact, there's ample research to demonstrate that there has not been any causal relationship between 2.5 and mortality since the mid-1980s, 35 years ago. If you look at asthma cases, and PM 2.5 have plunged over the last 20 years, while asthma cases have exploded. The lower the PM, the higher the asthma. Explain that. Yet the regulators continue to push a narrative that reducing PM 2.5 saves lives simply because the calculation of the $10 million statistical value of life supports the adoption of very expensive regulations and justifies them based on the health benefits exceeding the cost to industry. It is a myth for which there is simply no empirical support, and a phantom benefit that simply does not exist. In 2010, CARB hosted a day-long symposium with the major researchers in the area of PM 2.5 health effects. At the conclusion of that session, even the leading researcher, Mr. Jarrett, whose data is most often cited as the source of premature death from PM 2.5, admitted that his own data did not demonstrate a relationship between the two. He has never shared his raw data and never allowed it to be independently reviewed, but that is a significant admission, one that has major cost impacts on our industry. I would implore you to take a deep breath before the matter of PM 2.5 and carefully review all the very fine and contradictory research available on the effects on mortality before you decide to set a new standard. Wishing for a better outcome by lowering the number is not what the public needs. You owe it to the public to get the numbers right. This is the one job of science and the best job for regulators. Cherry picking research doesn't enhance your credibility or improve public health, and it does little to advance our understanding of the health effects of PM 2.5. If you're going to force industry to spend billions more on reducing PM 2.5, let's at least get an equal health benefit for the cost. If we're not getting that by this action, and you cannot claim that we are. Thank you.
Okay, any questions from the panel? Okay, we will move on to our next speaker. Tom Golab with the American Council on Science and Health.
Thank you. On December 23rd, 2020, EPA completed its review of the full body of currently available scientific evidence and exposure risk information, decided to retain the existing ozone NAAQS. EPA's decision is based on its judgment that the current NAAQS protect health with an adequate margin of safety, including the health of at-risk populations, and protect the public welfare from adverse effects. The existing primary and secondary standards established in 2015 are 0.07 parts per million as the fourth highest daily maximum 8-hour concentration average across these consecutive years. Using a nationwide network of monitoring sites, EPA has developed ambient air quality trends for particulate pollution, also called PM. PM 2.5 describes fine inhalable particles with diameters that are generally less than 2.5 micrometers and smaller. Under the Clean Air Act, the EPA sets and reviews national air quality standards for PM. Air quality monitors measure concentrations of PM throughout the country. EPA, state, tribal, and local agencies use that data to ensure that PM in the air is at levels that protect public health and the environment. Nationally, average PM 2.5 concentrations have decreased over the past 20 years, and the nation is on track for continued improvement of the clean air that we already enjoy. We've gone from 13.5 parts to down to 7.5 parts. The only locations in the entire nation with potentially questionable PM 2.5 levels are in Southern California, impacted by vehicular emissions and far from heavy industry. Improving that situation will require a detailed investigation of specific PM components and their sources. A purely bureaucratic response from Washington will not do the job. Efficient regulations require local solutions. I have three main scientific issues. Many taxpayer-funded researchers claim diseases caused by PM 2.5 are on the rise, yet the EPA's measurements show there to be a drop in ozone and PM 2.5. Clearly, these diseases can't be caused by ozone and PM 2.5. The data show there to be an inverse relationship. If the EPA's measurements of ozone and PM 2.5 show them to be falling, and NASA satellite images corroborate these measurements, then the regulations are working, and we should continue to let the existing regulations continue to do their job. It makes no sense to waste taxpayer funds on studies linking certain diseases to ozone and PM 2.5. Regulations intended to protect public health depend on accurate measures of human exposure, but we spend up to 90% of our lives indoors, and even more for the most vulnerable among us, notably infants and frail elderly. EPA has an office for indoor air quality. It seems disconnected from the EPA's epidemiologists and rulemaking. Indoor PM 2.5 includes cigarette smoke, cooking fumes, pet dander, household dust, but only a fraction of the outdoor air pollution that infiltrates indoors. While outdoor PM 2.5 levels tend to be relatively uniform, except near traffic, this is far from the case within the residences in the areas covered by outdoor monitoring. This situation not only threatens public health, but it invalidates all the outdoor epidemiological studies in which EPA rulemaking has been based.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Okay, we will go on to our next speaker, Warren Kenderski.
Thank you, Aaron. I wish to make 3 points about the EPA CASAC process on PM 2.5. The first point is on irreproducible research. More than a decade ago, it was acknowledged that traditional areas of epidemiology research show at least 20 false positive, irreproducible results for every one true positive result. A longtime editor of the British Medical Journal, Richard Smith, noted last year, it may be time to move from assuming that research has been honestly conducted and reported to assuming it to be untrustworthy until there is some evidence to the contrary. The extent to which the EPA and its advisory committees rely on irreproducible research for rulemaking is unknown and cannot be known, as the underlying data is not public, nor is the data held by the EPA. Point 2, violations of scientific integrity. The 2022 White House Office of Science and Technology Policy report acknowledges that violations of scientific integrity can occur at US federal agencies. This can include suppression, delay, or censorship of science, mischaracterization of science, manipulation of science. The potential for these violations within the US EPA and its advisory committees is unknown, as virtually none of the data for epidemiology studies that they rely on is public, nor is it held by the EPA. The final point, transparency. Under the new administration, the EPA canceled the previous administration's rulemaking, the transparency rule. The transparency rule was an effort to make data more public. Virtually none of the data used in studies that the EPA relies on for rulemaking are public. The EPA should abide by the 2022 White House OSTP guidance, admit they were wrong to cancel the transparency rule. The rule should be reinstated and defended to increase scientific integrity and transparency within the EPA and its advisory committees. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any questions from the panel? Okay, we'll move on to our next speaker. Frank Kaufman with the 12 Gates Foundation. Frank, are you on? Okay, I don't see him on here. Okay, we'll move on to our next speaker, Kathleen Marquardt.
Hello, I'm Kathleen Marquardt, Vice President of American Policy Association, American Policy Center, excuse me. Why are you talking about tightening air quality standards today? Is it because of the unprecedented outing of the independent industry representatives from both of the EPA panels, SAB and CASAC, with cronies of the Environmental Policy Agency dependent on those government grants? Is this to tighten the ground level ozone standard as an indirect way to regulate carbon dioxide and fossil fuels? If so, the results will damage businesses, harm workers, and destroy the economy. The previous administration had banned current recipients of EPA grants from serving as independent science advisors because they weren't independent. They owed their allegiance to the EPA. What credible board would do otherwise? Highly qualified people here have noted there is no justification for tightening the national air quality standards for ozone and particulate matter. And as Steve Malloy has stated publicly, if the members of CASAC picked by the Biden team are anything like the ones picked by the Obama team, they could very well determine that there is no safe exposure to ozone. And so the national air quality standard should be set to as low as 0. The nightmare scenario then would be that all states are thrown out of compliance with the Clean Air Act, and the EPA becomes the de facto state economic regulator, dictating to states what emissions are allowed. This situation could go on forever, since a substantial amount of ozone is naturally occurring. Had the boards remained uncorrupted, had they still included industry representatives, the committees would still be providing objective scientific advice to the federal government. And this hearing would not have to be going on. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Okay, we'll move on to our next speaker, Darren Backs with the Heritage Foundation.
Thank you for this opportunity to provide comments. My name is Darren Backs. I'm a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Views I express are my own and shouldn't be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. Today, I'd like to focus on process and scientific integrity. In December 2020, the EPA decided to retain existing PM standards. That's only about a year ago. While the EPA administrator did not have to follow CASAC's recommendations, in fact did so in making the decisions. CASAC was also very clear on major points. For example, CASAC members supporting the retention of the annual standard rightfully pointed out that, quote, associations reported in epidemiologic studies are not necessarily indicative of causal relationships, and such associations can reasonably be explained in light of uncontrolled confounding and other potential sources of error and bias. They also pointed out, quote, in accountability studies, reductions of PM 2.5 concentrations have not clearly reduced mortality risks, especially when confounding was tightly controlled. Also, from EPA's own data from 2000 and 2020, the PM 2.5 concentration levels had decreased by 41%. So why are we even here? Why are the standards being addressed again, even though Congress required the EPA to review and, if appropriate, revise the standards every 5 years? It's problematic, even on its face, to review standards immediately after the EPA already decided to retain them. The draft policy assessment itself states what precipitated this new review. On January 20th, 2021, President Biden issued an executive order on protecting public health and the environment and restoring science to tackle the climate crisis, which directed review of certain agency actions. So we appear to be here today because of his first day in office. President Biden issued this executive order and included the decision to retain the PM 2.5 standards as one of the agency actions to review, as opposed to being here for genuine, new, and compelling scientific reasons that require the unusual step of acting before Congress wanted. In 2009, President Obama issued a memorandum of scientific integrity, arguing that the public must be able to trust the science and the scientific process used by agencies. He was absolutely right. Unfortunately, the current process undermines that trust, and this trust story only gets worse. Less than a year ago, EPA Administrator Michael Regan dismissed all of the advisors for 2 legally required panels, Science Advisory Board and CASAC. The shocking move made before the EPA's decision to review the standards certainly gives the impression, right or wrong, that the administrator wants to hear only from those who will support President Biden's agenda. John Graham, who had led the EPA's Science Advisory Board, stated after this purge, quote, now for the first time in the agency's 50-year history, we have an administrator interested in scientific advice only from those scientists he has personally appointed, close quote. This action alone undermines anything coming from this newly formed CASAC. And I recognize that it may not be fair to this CASAC, but the reality and why such a purge, and this is the reality, why such a purge never should have existed. So what should be done? I would just say that CASAC shouldn't be reviewing standards at this time, and I strongly urge the EPA to stop the process and revisit the standards consistent with the 5-year schedule. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Okay, we will then move on to our next speaker, Georgia Murray.
Thank you.
The Appalachian Mountain Club, sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Briefly, I am a staff scientist representing the Appalachian Mountain Club, a nonprofit conservation and recreation organization with a mission to foster the protection, enjoyment, and understanding of the outdoors. Vibrant recreational-based communities and economies, valued at more than 700 billion nationally, benefit from cleaner air, clearer mountain views, clearer night skies, and healthy ecosystems and waterways. We strongly support CASAC's recommendation in regards to the PM 2.5 health standards and agree that more stringent levels are supported by the science. We support the lower end of the ranges presented to be most protective of public health, including sensitive groups and rural regions where wood smoke is prevalent in winter. Regarding secondary standards, EPA's draft ISA lacked sufficient review of ecosystem impacts, and with the unfortunate compressed schedule, this deficiency carries over to the current drafts and being reviewed by CASACs. We urge CASACs to recommend to EPA that the deficiencies in the secondary standard science in this review, due to the time constraints, should be fully evaluated in the unfolding NOx, SOx, and PM review. Deficiencies aside, EPA and CASACs must advance and rely on the latest science that supports setting separate PM 2.5 secondary standards in the draft PA. We agree with EPA and CASACs that there is a causal relationship between PM 2.5 and visibility effects, and further agree with CASACs that EPA's current draft PA is flawed with regards to its focus on a 30 deciview threshold, when existing visibility preference studies show less than 50% acceptability, with a PM 2.5 visibility index range of 20 to 25 deciviews being more representative. Importantly and correctly, CASACs also points out that the draft ISA supplemental identifies contrast rather than total light extinction is more uniformed as a metric in regards to level of acceptable visual air quality across different locations. Therefore, we agree with CASACs that the final PMPA should use the acceptable contrast value to help develop the secondary PM standards. The annual secondary standard should be at least as, if not more protective than the primary standard. And while regional differences are clear in the level of PM 2.5, it is not an excuse for inaction in setting a secondary standard. Strengthening both the 24-hour and annual national secondary standards will improve visibility and ecosystem protections across all regions. We agree with CASACs that the draft document should include the latest physical science from the IPCC 2021 report. Climate change's impacts are only worsening, and the role of more frequent intense wildfires and PM pollution, and in particular how the relationship in PM chemistry and light extinction may be changing or vary regionally, are also important to document. Finally, we support updating the risk assessment process to consider multiple secondary PM adjustments for simulating just meeting current and alternative standards. This could allow improved insights into what is needed in reductions to protect different regions and populations, and would allow a more thorough consideration of impacts to the most sensitive vistas, ecosystems, and waterways. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the panel? Okay, we'll move on to our next speaker, John Bachman with the Environmental Protection Network.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm John Bachman, speaking for the Environmental Protection Network. I worked in EPA's Air Office for 33 years in science policy, with a lead role in all reviews of the NAAQS for PM through 2006. First, as a veteran of the NAAQS process, it's been refreshing to witness a return to a CASAC and consultants competent in all relevant disciplines as they engage in productive discussions and review of these documents. The combination of former and new panelists worked well and brought additional insights, for example, in discussing sensitive populations. Second, we agree with the unanimous conclusion of CASAC and consultants that the current suite of fine particle standards is not sufficient to protect public health. We believe the majority of CASAC members got it right in their draft letter recommending strengthening both the annual and daily primary standards to level with ranges between 8 and 10 micrograms per cubic meter annual and 25 to 30 micrograms per cubic meter daily. Based on a number of recent studies, we believe a 10 microgram per cubic meter annual standard would provide little or no margin of safety, and we favor the low end of the range. As stated in our December written comments, we place more emphasis on the evidence as opposed to the risk assessment. Because, as Dr. Boylan noted, average annual levels in the US are already at 8 micrograms per cubic meter or below, it's likely only a limited number of areas would experience meaningful risk reductions at 10. More importantly, a substantial number of credible US and Canadian studies found effects at lower mean levels. The CASAC majority was correct in noting the problem with discounting risk to individuals exposed at the design value monitor while pointing to protection for the average. We also agree with the majority's rationale in placing the main emphasis on evidence-based information rather than on the risk assessment and recommending stronger daily standards. As detailed in our December comments, we also agree that a harder look at the implications of controlled human exposures at lower levels favors strengthening the current standard. In fact, we believe these studies may support consideration of alternative short-term exposure goals in the Air Quality Index. Finally, CASAC notes in its draft the supplemental review's compressed time frame as problematic and recommends this not be the future norm. EPN certainly agrees, but we're concerned this procedural recommendation in the text could be misconstrued as implying the current review's substance and CASAC's advice are less than adequate. CASAC is not asking to see second drafts of the documents first and should clarify that once EPA addresses their major comments and recommendations, the final ISA assessment and PA are adequate for rulemaking, and they and CASAC advice deserve the administration's full and careful consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay, we'll move on to our next speaker, Daniel Orozco with the National Parks Conservation Association.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in this meeting. My name is Daniel Orozco. I represent the National Parks Conservation Association, NPCA. NPCA is a nationwide organization with over 1.3 million members and supporters who care deeply about the health and well-being of our nation's most treasured natural areas and historic resources, as well as the health of all Americans and those who choose to recreate in and enjoy our national parks. We applaud CASAC's recommendation in regards to the primary standards. However, we consider that EPA has failed to fully consider the science around the harm to ecosystems and visibility from fine particle matter, and in doing so has led to an insufficient draft policy assessment. EPA and CASAC should ensure that the fine PM policy assessment include the latest science that supports setting of distinct and separate PM 2.5 secondary standards to protect public welfare. At the least, the secondary standards ought to be as stringent as the primary standards, if not more. PM 2.5 is a major cause of regional haze, which reduces visibility across the nation, spoiling the stunning views in many of our prized natural parks and wilderness areas, as well as inner cities and rural communities. While many of these places are afforded the highest level of protection through the Regional Haze Program, this program cannot operate in a vacuum, and stronger PM 2.5 secondary standards will go a significant way toward assisting these places in achieving their clean air goals. We agree with EPA and CASAC's finding that indicate a causal relationship between PM 2.5 and visibility effects. We also agree with CASAC and EPA current draft policy assessment is inadequate due to its focus on 30 decibel threshold when a visibility index range of 20 to 25 decibels is more representative. Moreover, we support CASAC's observation regarding the use of contrast as opposed to total light extinction as a metric of acceptable visual air quality across different locations. The final PM policy assessment should use an acceptable contrast value to help develop the secondary PM standards. In addition to visibility, the collective effects of fine particle matter in our ecosystems are harmful to the soil, wildlife, aquatic ecosystem, and plants of our natural places in this nation. With all this in view, we urge the panel to recommend secondary standards to be at least, if not more, as rigorous as the primary standards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions from the panel? Okay, we'll go on to our next speaker. Our next speaker will be Mary Cruz.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, good morning. I'm going to address the tightening of the PM 2.5 from a personal perspective. I am a single 77-year-old senior citizen and also a Pacific Islander living in California who has retired but had to go back to work because of the rising cost of gas, my utility bills, and the ability to maintain the upkeep of my home. As I said, being a senior citizen and trying to find employment has been exceedingly difficult because of my age. Employers want younger people who can grow with their companies. Since COVID, my utility bills more than doubled. My car gasoline costs have doubled. I've had to change my living style and how I heat my house and what and when to use appliances. I've been on a fixed income of since 2008 from Social Security of $1,300 and now unable to maintain my frugal living style of living. In the past 2 years, I've had to replace my old 2002 Ford Explorer that had over 200,000 miles on it to a smaller economical car. Thus, when I did this, I thought I would be saving money, but in actuality, I'm now paying more to fill my economical car than I did when I had my SUV. California has been forced to comply with your costly clean air requirements in order to meet the EPA PM 2.5 regulations. It has cost California residents, especially senior citizens, more money at the pump, paying utility bills, employing others to assist them with the work needed to maintain their homes. And in some cases, they've lost their homes because they cannot maintain the continuous growing costs. Americans should not have to suffer when other countries like China do not meet these same requirements. Also, I'm informed that a statistical analysis of Medicare records is being used to gather this information. I have never given anyone my permission to use my information regarding my Medicare records. Isn't this a violation of HIPAA rules gathering this information for your study? Shame on you. It seems that if you were really concerned about the health effects of PM 2.5, you should be conducting your studies in those countries that still have high pollution levels. Yet you get paid a lot of money, so you are not as concerned about meeting growing costs to maintain your styles. I'm deeply concerned as a senior citizen now seeking employment in order to live above poverty level. I feel justified in stating my views. I'm just trying to pay my bills and put gas in my car and food on the table. I'm currently paying my bills on an every other month basis just so I can keep the utilities on and pay for groceries. Stop robbing the residents with all your costs and studies that are not scientifically valid. I understand that lowering the PM 2.5 NAAQS is going to further increase the energy costs. Do you expect the citizens should be further burdened with this? Thank you for your time. A very concerned senior citizen.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Okay, we will move on to our next speaker, Hank de Carbonell. Hank, I think I saw you on. You're muted if you're trying to speak. Hank, are you there? Okay, we will circle back. We'll go on to our next speaker, Jane Orient with Doctors for Disaster Preparedness.
Good afternoon. I'm a specialist in internal medicine, president of Doctors for Disaster Preparedness, executive director of the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, and author of Sapphira's Art and Science of Bedside Diagnosis. For many reasons, I have long questioned the legitimacy of the PM 2.5 NAAQS for particulates. In particular, the EPA claim that PM 2.5 can cause premature deaths is simply false. Based on my knowledge of medicine, epidemiology, and toxicology, death cannot be caused by the inhalation of about 100 micrograms of PM 2.5 per day, which is the current NAAQS level of 12 micrograms per cubic meter. As asserted in the Young versus EPA lawsuit, the current effort of the Biden EPA to tighten PM 2.5 standards seriously violates the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which requires that advisors be fairly balanced in terms of the points of view representative. Additionally, the activist PM 2.5 panel is failing to advise EPA administrator of any adverse public health, welfare, social, economic, or energy effects which may result from various strategies for attainment and maintenance of such standards. These serious adverse impacts will disproportionately affect disadvantaged groups, as some speakers have already pointed out. DDP meetings have featured lectures on PM 2.5 pseudoscience by Steve Malloy, James Enstrom, John Dale Dunn, and Robert Phelan. Articles on this subject published in the peer-reviewed Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons include Scientific Distortions in Fine Particulate Matter Epidemiology by James Enstrom in 2018. These highly qualified critics are not cited in the PM Integrated Science Assessment Supplement or the PM Policy Assessment. Furthermore, the 2017 Enstrom reanalysis found major flaws in the original 1995 Pope analysis of the American Cancer Society Cancer Prevention Study 2, which was the primary study used to establish the PM 2.5 NAAQS. Yet, Enstrom 2017 and page 1995 are not cited by the EPA. EPA is destroying honest environmental science and is promoting scientifically unjustified regulations that will seriously harm Americans. The current effort to tighten the PM 2.5 NAAQS must be stopped. Thank you.
Okay, any questions? Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker will be Janet Levy. Janet, are you on? Janet? Okay, so we will go ahead and circle back to some of the speakers that we missed. Ronald Stein with PTS Advance. Ronald, are you on? Okay, Jay Lair with Committee for Constructive Tomorrow. Jay, are you on? Okay, Frank Kaufman with 12 Gates Foundation. Frank, are you on? No, okay. Hank De Carbonell.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'd like to start with a quote. You can avoid reality, but you can't avoid the consequences of reality. That's from Ayn Rand. I'd like to talk a little bit about the realities of these decisions that are going on by the EPA. Right now, we have almost 70 ships circling and moping around about 150 miles off the coast of California and Baja, Mexico, waiting to tie up to appear to unload their containers. Inside those containers are many components required for the maintenance.
I was muted.
Could you hear me?
Yeah, yes, I can hear you.
Okay, inside those containers are a number of the components required to manufacture new diesel engines, new automobiles, as well as maintenance parts for the much ballyhooed diesel particulate filter, which does only controls emissions in less than a little more than half of diesel engines in use. We know this is true because CARB has spent millions of dollars through Southwest Research testing the diesel particulate filter, the only kind of filter allowed to control particulate matter in diesel engines, and it only works on about half the engines in use and only under the most ideal conditions. It's an absurdity that should not be allowed to continue. You have no proof of the PM 2.5, and you use tortured data to achieve those numbers. Those calculations are absurd. So So to tighten them up makes even less sense. In 2019, you had less than 20 counties in the United States that weren't compliant with the EPA 2.5 rules, less than 20 out of 3,007. What kind of consensus are you trying to talk about? It's an absurdity that should not be allowed to continue. I deal in the real world, and my real world is that we have trucks waiting, or we have ships tied, rolling around out in the ocean because there's trucks that can't be used in the ports to unload these ships. And justification by the EPA for this is the enormous amount of money being saved by these rules. EPA assumptions are an average life is worth 8.9 million, when the reality is it's about 1.5 million. When you start from 8.9 million, you can conjure up all sorts of phony baloney numbers. This thing is a farce. You haven't got any justification for PM 2.5 as a health risk, let alone increasing it and diminishing the economies of actually not just the United States, but the world. You need to deal with reality and not some hypothetical theological belief system. Thank you.
Okay, any questions?
Aaron, it's Jay Laird. Can I get on, Aaron?
Okay, so
Aaron?
we were circling back. Let me just double check again. Janet Levy. Janet, are you on? No. Okay, so we will go back to, how about we'll go to
Jay.
Ronald Stein, and then we will do Jay Lair after that.
Thank you.
Thank you. The proposed version by EPA for reductions in particulate matter by tightening PM 2.5 regulation would increase energy imports, generate higher worldwide emissions, and further increase energy costs for all Americans. In California, it will barely reduce particulate emission reductions while raising the nation's highest energy prices in California, even more for the Hispanic and African American populations that represent 18 of our 40 million residents, and the more than 2 million undocumented immigrants. America's 330 million residents are 4% of the world's population and professes to be the leader of everything, but tightening PM 2.5 for particulate matter is ludicrous when China, India, Indonesia, Japan, and Vietnam are sending their PM 2.5 across the Pacific Ocean to America, building new coal power plants. China, India, Indonesia, Japan, and Vietnam, representing more than 3 billion people, plan to build more than 600 coal-powered units, and African countries of 1.2 billion are planning to build more than 1,200 new coal and gas power plants by 2030. The EPA appears to be disconnected from the demands of most Americans, as it must be oblivious to the EIA January 2022 report that US fossil fuel production will reach record highs in 2023. The EPA may be sabotaging the American economy with shortages and inflation in the name of unattainable climate targets, and may go down in history as causing the continent to be homage to China for materials to go green and to Russia and OPEC for crude oil. It appears that EPA feels good about tightening the PM 2.5 regulation for particulate matter that may save the health of a few at the expense of all other Americans, while still maintaining their blinders toward millions of other worldwide fatalities as America continues to leak emissions and air quality responsibilities to developing countries halfway around the world that are experiencing about 11 million child deaths every year. The same countries that have virtually non-existent environmental regulations nor labor controls to protect the local workers in those developing countries. I hope the members of the EPA can sleep peacefully.
Okay, any questions? Okay, we'll go ahead and go to Jay Lair. with a
Can
committee.
you hear me?
Constructive tomorrow. Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, well, first I want to compliment you. This has been an outstanding meeting. The logistics of setting up the meeting the way you have is equal to the finest Zoom meeting I've ever been on. So congratulations. And I was muted by mistake before. Tightening the PM2.5 standard in the National Ambient Air Quality Standards will raise energy prices significantly without offering any benefit whatever to the health of the nation. Multiple studies prove this emphatically. The most detailed study, Air Quality and Acute Deaths in California from 2000 to 2012, was performed by Young, Smith, and Lopiano and described in a paper published just 4 years ago in the journal Regulatory Toxicology and Pharmacology. They studied California's 8 most populated air basins. They obtained daily air quality data for these 8 basins from the California Air Resource Board and more than 2 million electronic death certificates in these basins from the California Department of Public Health for the years 2000 through 2012. They analyzed more than 37,000 exposure days. All deaths were aggregated to a day, year, and basin. This possibly the most comprehensive study of its kind found no association between either ozone or PM2.5 levels and mortality using standard regression-based time series analysis. Extensive sensitivity analyses found these air quality variables do not add to the predictive ability of multiple models used in the study. The authors concluded they were unable to find a consistent and meaningful relationship between air quality and acute death rates in any of the 8 California air basin study, which included Sacramento Valley, San Francisco, San Diego, San Joaquin, Salton Sea, Mountain Counties, South Central, and South Coast. The standard method for showing cause and effect is through an experiment. One factor is changed and the result is examined. If another variable changes with the factor under study, after any confounding factors are eliminated, there is evidence of causality. Fairly recently, an increase in PM2.5 was observed due to major forest fires. This natural unintended experiment did not lead to an increase in mortality. No experiments exist with regard to EPA's desire to change the PM2.5 standard. In fact, just the opposite exists. Cox, Popkin, and Ricci studied 100 US cities where fine particulate matter varied significantly. They found no concurrent effects on mortality. This study was published in 2013 in Regulatory Toxicology and Pharmacology. I implore you not to tighten the 2.5 standard.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the panel? Okay, that concludes our public comment period. Thank you to all the public commenters for your participation. Leanne, I will hand the meeting back over to you.
Thank you, Aaron. And I also want to express my sincere appreciation to all the public commenters for sharing your perspectives with us. I think that's very helpful. And so now we will move on to discussing the draft CASAC ISA supplement report, and we'll start with the consensus responses. So if you want to turn to page 1 of the consensus responses, the executive summary section, and I ask the panel now if anyone has any proposed edits or other comments you wish to make about the executive summary charge question response. That's lines 18 to 35 on page 1 of the consensus report.
Leanne,
Yes.
this is John Bohms. Would it be helpful to show that on the screen or not?
I think in chatting with Aaron, we decided not to because
Okay.
then we get into too much wordsmithing, and we don't really want to spend our time wordsmithing. We are happy to wordsmith, but maybe not.
Okay, so long as you thought it through.
Yeah, thank you for asking though, because I did have the same question.
Leanne, sorry, this is Mark Weisskopf. Could you just point again to where you're referring to so I make sure I see what we're talking about?
Yeah, it's page 1 of the consensus responses, which on the PDF, I guess, is page 9. And it's the consensus response to the executive summary section, and it's lines 18 to 35. I'll go sort of chunk by chunk through this and open it up for discussion and input, try to break things up in sensible ways. So first, looking for any comments. I see Terry Gordon has his hand up.
Could you give us the exact title of that document?
The exact title of the document is 2-4-22 Draft CASAC PM ISA Supplement Report. It's page 9 of the PDF, or probably the Word document if you haven't edited it. It has page number 1 at the bottom because it's the first page of the consensus response report. Is everybody with me now?
Yeah, in other words, we're not starting with the letter, we're starting with
right
the consensus stuff.
Yeah, we're going to do the consensus responses first because the letter is pretty much a distillation of the consensus responses. So we want to make sure we agree on those before we go to the letter. Yeah, those of us.
Sorry, Leanne, the page number you gave, is that what's written on the document or the total number?
Right. So on the PDF, not written on the document, is the 9th page of the document. At the bottom of the page, it's page number 1, but it's 9 pages into the document itself.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and some of us are new. I actually spent a little time making sure I had all the documents ready for myself, because if you start editing, of course, changes the page numbers and things. So, and the line numbers. So, we didn't get any comments in advance either on this section. So if everybody has found where we are, I'm going to suggest maybe we can move on to section 1. And that is now page 2 of the document. That summarizes section 1, and it also talks about the causal determination framework. And Mark Frampton actually had several suggestions, so maybe I'll invite him to summarize them or present them to open up the discussion of this response. So now we're on page 2, and we will only go from like lines, our response, which is lines 5 to down to, we'll start with just lines 5 to 33. So that's an overall summary paragraph, a paragraph on line, starting on line 16 that talks about additional background and context, and then a paragraph starting on line 28 about the causal determination framework.
Yeah, and I'm not caught up here. I'm struggling with finding the right section and the right page and my comments, but
well, Jim has his hand up, so maybe I will turn it over to him, and I can slow down until everybody catches up. I realize that it takes a little while with versions and so on. Go ahead, Jim.
All right. So I had a comment on the paragraph. That was paragraph 28 to 33.
48 to 33. Can we?
I'm sorry, 28.
28. Okay. Yes, please.
28 to 33.
What page are we on?
We are now on page 2 as printed on the bottom of the document, at page 2 of the consensus responses, and that is what, page 10 of the PDF or probably the Word document before you edited it.
Yeah.
Original line 28 is where Jim wants to make a suggestion. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, so I had two possible suggestions. The first would be taking the last sentence of that section and moving it to the second sentence instead of the last sentence. Just because I think that flows better with the first sentence. I think they kind of go together. And that's not as important as my next comment, which my next comment, I wanted to propose some alternative text, and I'll read my proposed alternative text, and then I guess we can have discussions. And to me, I guess, I agree that this is the best tool currently available, but there's also, I think it needs to be recognized that this framework is being evaluated by National Academy of Sciences. So my proposed rewriting of what is currently the second sentence would read, while refinements and alternatives to this WOE framework are currently being evaluated by National Academy of Sciences Engineering, NASM. The causal determination framework is currently the best available tool, and the CASAC unanimously supports, remove the word continued, unanimously supports application of it for this NACS review. Because I don't want to make comments about future NAC reviews, knowing that this report is going to be coming out very soon from National Academy of Sciences. And I think, I think it's appropriate for this NACS review, and I think that's all we should comment on, instead of saying continued application of it for NACS reviews, which implies future NAC reviews. So that's my tweaking to the language for discussion. And I can read it again if you would like.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Corey and see what he has to say.
I was just going to suggest something very similar to what James just suggested, is that I think we can be careful to not put something that we say to be potentially at odds with the outcome of that National Academies panel. I don't think that's the intention of anybody on the committee, but knowing that I think just being careful around the language so as to prevent that might be worthwhile. And I think, I'd have to look at it to say for sure, but I think what James said might have done just that.
Thank you. John.
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah.
I support both the change of the order of sentences that was suggested, and I like Corey. I think it's having the caveat about the National Academy's review is good. So I support what's been said.
Thank you. So Mark.
Yes, and I also support those changes. I sent some proposed edits to this paragraph, but my main concern here is that the paragraph as it's written sort of sounds like, it's kind of a review of what the previous CASAC did, but it makes it sound like we agree with the previous CASAC's recommendation on the causality framework. It becomes clear in the next paragraph, starting on line 28 there, what the CASAC's actual view is here. But I think however we revise the previous paragraph starting on line 16, I think we should make it clear that this is what the previous CASAC did. It's not necessarily our opinion, and that we are not challenging the use of the current framework in this re-review. But I agree, we don't necessarily have to say that it should continue to be used. until we have the report of the National Academy.
Yeah, so you're referring also to a paragraph that starts on line 16, and your proposed edits that you sent in advance talks about, you proposed that line would be start out, this background should include a summary of the previous CASACs, consideration of causal determination framework, and there were some other edits. I guess you removed some text there and shortened it. And then the next paragraph, you were suggesting we say the current CASAC notes. So that the point that you just made allows us to distinguish the previous advice from which is pretty much what's summarized in paragraph 16, and the current advice. And then what I heard is that you also support the changes that that Jim proposed.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Terry.
So I support everything, all the word changes that Jim said, but I disagree with the thing about the NAS report. It doesn't seem logical that EPA and the CASAC committee is going to be waiting on an NAS report as if that's going to instantly change the process. It's something that EPA and CASAC will probably look at and debate for years. So I don't see why we want to imply this. So I just object to the word this, that's all.
You object to the word, oh, this, okay.
Well, I guess I object to changing things just based on a report that's going to come out at some time, as if that's going to instantly change EPA's causality framework.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. We shouldn't be saying that. I think we should, and I think the text as it is does allow that, we'll consider, EPA is obviously going to consider what's in the NAS report when it does come out, and that CASAC will as well. But I agree, we shouldn't be saying that we're going to immediately adopt it or change things when that report does come out.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I don't think what I wrote actually says that. It says, it'll be considered, but for this, for this review, we're good to go with this, but I don't want to be committing to this framework for future reviews without having ever seen the report. So that I don't think my wording actually was saying that there would be any immediate changes, although in theory, there could be changes in the future.
Corey.
I mean, I guess this is all splitting hairs a little bit, but it sounds like what we've discussed and what I think we have clear consensus on is that there was no reason for us or EPA right now to consider anything other than the weight of evidence formulation that goes back to the ISA preamble. And personally, I think we can say that without calling it the best available tool. And I think we can say that and acknowledge the fact that pending results of some other National Academies Committee and EPA deliberation down the line, all of this could change. And that maybe we don't have to declare that this is best, just to declare that we don't see any reason to have abandoned what has been laid out over this, what the weight of evidence determinations as originally laid out. So I guess, again, to me, I think there's a difference between us saying this is the best thing that we could do right now, which sounds more to me like the purview of that National Academies Committee, versus us saying, we don't see it. This is how it's been done at EPA. This is how it's documented at EPA. And we don't see any reason to change it right now.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Barbara.
I guess, let's see, I'm not muted. I guess I was listening I wrote down what I think the edits were. And if I can read where I ended up now, and then Corey's comments. And maybe if I read where I think we are, if this is where I think we are, I would agree with this. And it's a short paragraph, so it's okay, I'm just gonna read it. There might be a little edit on the front that Corey made that I missed, but the causal determination framework as documented in the preamble to the ISA 2015 preamble is based on the weight of evidence and professional judgment. This causal framework has been developed over many years and has been reviewed and supported by the CASAC during multiple previous reviews. While continued refinements and alternatives to this WOE framework are currently being evaluated by the National Academy of Sciences, CASAC unanimously supports the use of causal determination framework for NAAQS reviews. Is that what, I mean, I would support that. Is that what everybody is saying?
Well, I support it for this review. I don't want to say anything about future reviews at this point in time.
For this review, right? So that eliminates saying that whether or not we know it's the best available tool, but it's an appropriate tool for this review.
So I would agree with what you just read, Barbara.
Yeah, so she didn't have the word this, and I think that we might have some discussion about that because of the implication about what that means for future reviews. I think what you're saying, Jim, is that based on the National Academy recommendations or other things, there could be changes, and therefore the current framework might get revised, and so you don't want to commit to the current framework in the future. But I think a number of us are also concerned that if we say we only support it for this review, it might imply that that it could be thrown out in the next time round, and I don't think any of us want to say that either. So, Barbara, are you still wanting to comment, or are you done?
No, I'm done. I felt like I needed to know if that's where we were, so I appreciate it. I'll put my hand in.
Thank you. George.
I think we're stumbling over our own words at this point on this paragraph. Note that it does say that framework is currently, emphasis on the word, currently the best available tool, which is true. I think maybe the problems with the next part of that sentence, CASAC supports continued application, maybe just a little bit of a disclaimer there saying, unless ... or unless the NAS review, . But currently it is. I think we're all in agreement on that one, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So I don't want to make it, I don't think we need to make a huge thing out of this. We certainly cover the NAS review in the previous paragraph. So, some very minor changes in addition to moving the sentence that Jim noted, the last sentence to earlier in that paragraph, which I think makes it flow better. But I don't think we need to get too wrapped up in this.
Okay, thank you. Christina.
Yes, so I liked what Barb has written down for the language. I thought it answered a lot of the concerns and questions, and then I also agree what George was just saying in terms of splitting too many hairs. I mean, as long as we don't say only this review or for future reviews, just saying this review, I think is pretty clear in terms of for this review, because this is really supposed to be the focus. We're not supposed to be kind of planning out for the future anyway. So just make it be present for this review, I think will be clear and still allows for changes in the future.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy.
Yeah, I just would suggest maybe removing that second clause to avoid, I don't know really what it adds, but that would address Jim's concern and then George, and actually my concern too about saying this review might imply that, we're expecting something to change in the future and that this is currently okay. But so, yeah, I would say take out that second clause.
Which second clause would you
So,
erase words?
Right. So The causal determination is currently the best available tool. And then, and I would, and the CASAC unanimously supports, I would remove till the end of the sentence.
So you're suggesting unanimously supports its continue.
Or you could say is currently the best available tool for conducting NACS reviews.
I think some of us are recommending we not use the best available language. We're just, Corey, if you can restate.
I can say, I was more questioning whether we have consensus on that. Maybe we do, that it is the best available. I would not object to including the term best available myself. That was more my point.
Okay. Okay, there's been enough changes. Is there someone, Barbara, maybe you want to reread your proposed text? Maybe you caught some of these details.
Yeah, Corey, the one I didn't catch, I think, is, didn't you say something, little phrase was supposed to be added to the very beginning of the paragraph?
Oh, geez, I don't think so.
I
think you had captured.
Sorry,
I'm done.
I did, based on what Mark Frampton suggested, that the current CASAC notes, to distinguish it from the previous paragraph, which was really summarizing the previous CASAC's deliberations. That was the main thing there.
Okay. So, and I'm going to read it, but I'm going to suggest one more edit because we seem to be a little bit, now we're, wordsmithing this a little bit, but there's some debate about this word "this," and what is the meaning of this? So we could actually just remove those last 3 or 4 words for this NACS review, and let me read it that way and see, because I think it will work well. So here's what I have. Maybe I'll read a little slowly. The current CASAC notes that the causal determination framework, as documented in the 2015 preamble to the ISA, is based on weight of evidence and professional judgment. The causal framework has been developed over many years and has been reviewed and supported by the CASAC during multiple previous reviews. While continued refinements and alternatives to this WOE framework are currently being evaluated by the National Academies of Science, the CASAC unanimously supports continued application of the causal determination framework.
Okay, we're good with that then?
I'm good with it.
Great, thank you. Mark?
Yeah, I mean, the only problem I have with it is that last sentence that makes it sound like regardless of what the NAS review ends up saying, that we think that this framework ought to continue to be used. So it seems to contradict our previous statement that it could be refined.
So the removing that last phrase didn't help, really, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, it's really the part about what did it say? Unanimously, the phrase unanimously supports its continued application for NACS review.
So we, it's like the CASAC unanimously supports, you're right, that it's either current application or it's continued application. It's either for NACS review or for this NACS review. And I guess maybe that's where we're.
Yeah, so either one of those changes would be fine with me, to say it's current application or for this NACS review. I do think we need to allow the room for change.
Sorry, I thought the discussion just before that Corey was weighing in on, Barbara would have suggested taking, it sounded like the last sentence in what you just read took the part of the sentence Corey was talking about that he was actually suggesting taking out. So your last sentence included part, or that Jeremy maybe was saying that your last sentence seemed to include the part about CASAC unanimously supporting continued application of it for NACS reviews, when it sounded to me like the discussion said the part of that sentence we wanted to keep was not that, but the prior part, that the causal determination framework is currently the best available tool. Could you sort of, would it make sense to replace the last sentence you read with that first part of the phrase?
So the last sentence would then I'm trying to think of a word here. It's not, it shouldn't be feels exactly, but let me try that anyway. So
something like the CASAC unanimously believes that the causal determination framework is currently the best available tool. Leave it at that.
And then stop there. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and I'm thinking we want to not spend too much time trying to wordsmith. Maybe what we want to do is summarize a couple of the main points, right? That we that what I heard is that we want to keep a weight of evidence framework. The current one is okay for the current review. And it may change in the future, and we support that as well.
So I get it now, and I think I get it. I didn't understand what Jeremy was saying, but it does make sense. Of course. He said, while continued refinements and alternatives to the WOE framework are currently being evaluated by the National Academies of Science, the CASAC unanimously believes that the causal determination framework is the best available tool, period.
Although you left out currently. Currently the best available tool.
Is currently the best available tool. Is that it? Is that it? That sounds right to me.
That works for me.
Okay, I'm going to suggest we move on, but actually move backwards a little bit, because I don't think we completely, I guess Mark just had some wordsmithing edits for the previous paragraph, which basically, as I already summarized, that was the paragraph that started on line 16. The thrust of those edits were a little bit of wordsmithing about the current work of the National Academy, and that it's a previous CASAC's opinion. So I think that was the thrust of that. Are there any additional comments or edits on from lines 5 through what was before we edited it 33?
On
page 2. So lines 28 to 33 were where we had an extensive discussion. There was a few wordsmithing edits that I summarized that Mark proposed for paragraphs starting on line 16. And now I'm proposing that we move on to the paragraph that starts on line 35 to 39, which is about constraining the scope. And the main point there was that the constrained scope is really only for this draft supplement, and we think that it should be noted in the introduction. So that's that paragraph. Hearing no, Michael Kleinman has a comment.
Yeah, this is just relatively minor, but I think, where did I put it? Yeah, on line 37, I think it should be made explicit that only including updated studies for the effects that had a determination of a causal relationship in the previous ISA. To make it specific that that's where the definition came from for what would be included in this review.
Okay, so add the definition for the for what was included in this review. Okay. Okay, we'll do that. All right, moving on to the bottom of page 2, the paragraph that starts on line 41 and goes on to line 8 on page 3. That's a paragraph on the scope about limited to US and Canadian studies. Any proposed edits to that? I saw Mark had 1 or 2 minor minor wordsmithing edits we'll incorporate. Okay, I'm going to go on now. We're on page 3, the paragraph that starts on line 10 and ends on line 29. And that is the text on causal modeling studies wording. And Corey, you have some comments on that.
Yeah, in line around 22 and 23 of that paragraph where we suggest some alternative labeling of these studies. I would like to advocate for our suggestions to not involve the word causal, if possible. And instead of saying advanced causal modeling, say advanced epidemiological modeling, or something along those lines. I'm just owing to all of our other comments that this committee has had in discussion about how the word causal is being wielded in this context. And I think the point is that these are new analysis strategies, at least new to the NACs or the PM NACs. And that to me is more important here than the fact that they have the word, somebody called them causal at some point.
Okay, I see a couple more hands up, so maybe we'll come to that, and maybe when we circle back, if assuming we all agree on this, you could actually suggest the words that we replace for those couple of phrases. But Michelle.
Yeah, I'll be super brief. As usual, I agree with Corey, just for the reasons that we already discussed in the last meeting. I think that this language, I've always been concerned about this language. I had conversations with Corey at a poster session at Harvard when he was presenting this work as one of the first people to really use this method, develop this method for air pollution. So I think this is a really important point. And I don't want to volunteer you, Corey, but I'm sure that I agree with Leanne that you probably can draft some really great language that avoids misinterpretation and is also true to the statistical methods.
Thank you. George.
I vote for novel confounding adjustment method. I agree with Corey. Keeping the word causal in that descriptor just furthers the confusion. But that novel confounding adjustment method, I think it seems to clearly express what we're trying to say without any confusion.
Okay, Corey, do you feel comfortable? I'm putting you on the spot, proposing now on the fly we have, at the moment, we have 3 phrases as possible choices. I don't know.
Yeah,
if you-
I can suggest some, yes, and folks can tell me what they think. So I had in my notes, well, first of all, I think modern or novel confounding adjustment methods, which already appears and which George was just referring to, I think that one's okay. Because I think that is the type of causal methodology that's being described in the ISA, in the supplement. Other terms I have are advanced epidemiological modeling tools, modern epidemiological tools, strategies, pick your term. I guess maybe what I'm suggesting is because this, I think this only refers to the epidemiological analyses, and it refers to how certain new studies are being analyzed. And so I think that we should refer to them as epidemiological analysis tools, whether novel, modern, something along those lines.
Thank you. John?
I'll be brief. I also agree with Corey's suggestion. I strongly agree, actually. Also being at the School of Public Health where a lot of this work is being done. I have a little problem with advanced, because that suggests that it's better, all the way around than traditional epidemiologic tools. I mean, I think the approach has advantages, but it doesn't really, as we've said, doesn't replace traditional epi. So that's my only caveat.
Thank you. Jeremy?
Yeah, I'll just echo John's point there that it's kind of creating a new typology, and I'd be concerned about those of us who are not using modern methods right now. Clearly, I would defer to Corey to think of the best method, but think about how that would be creating a subset of traditional models that maybe would not be in fashion anymore.
Mark?
Yeah, just to first concur with what Corey was saying, and I guess I would advocate for something more along the lines of novel confounding adjustment methods, because what you're really doing is finding new ways to address this issue. And not that the old ones were bad, but these are just new ones that get at it in a different way and increase our feeling of causality.
Thank you. Corey?
That's what I was going to say. That's why they're in the novelty is why they're in the supplement. And so let's call them novel. Forget that I said advanced. I agree with what the other said.
All right, so we're just talking about one set of words, then novel confounding adjustment, and we don't need all the other terms?
I would still advocate for saying something like novel epidemiological analysis tools or novel epidemiological methods. Slightly more general than just being about confounding, which I think is worth saying.
I like that.
Okay.
Me too.
Just don't like the modern part, because for those of us who are pre-modern.
Can I say modern again?
No, you didn't say it, but that's good. I just don't want to feel like I feel like I'm pre-modern in many ways, but now.
If you think you're old, Jeremy, how about me?
But I think the modern, not modern, advanced, not advanced, causal, not causal, I think it's all a version of this thing where I think it's creating these binaries that I don't think any of us think are actually there for this purpose.
All right, so the 3 terms that we'll replace with what's there are novel confounding adjustment tools, novel epidemiological modeling tools, and novel epidemiologic methods. That's what I heard. Okay. Thank you. I think I also I flagged that 2 places where, we're recommending this. So that's a strong statement to EPA. I want to make sure we had consensus on that. Just raise your hand if there's any concerns there. We say would be appropriate. You could interpret that as, maybe we want to make that a little stronger. That's on line 24, the word would. Does anybody have a comment on making that a little stronger?
Is it worth trying to say something about what exactly we're trying to avoid? Instead of just saying, we'd say it's more, we could be stronger if we wanted to try and articulate would avoid, I don't know, something like this either or choice that I don't think any of us is comfortable with.
Yeah,
I don't have a good suggestion on how to say that. I guess I'm questioning whether we want to try to come up with a way to say that.
Yeah, I guess also kind of what I'm wondering is that, there's definitely a clear reason why we want to move away from this causal modeling terminology. But it's kind of not explicitly mentioned, right? And then sort of the linkage between what this term, how it was used and now how we're kind of thinking of it differently. I mean, one could argue that we may want to kind of explicitly address that in the previous version of the ISA, these types of models were referred to as this, and the reason why we don't like this term is, for whatever reason. I mean, that would be kind of a little bit more transparent, I think, and maybe it would be a bit clearer for those reading it, and then not just having to kind of deal with a new term for this type of model. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there, but I think everybody clearly knows, what this term came to mean and how it was like co-opted in some sense. This is my feeling.
Yeah, I think some of the paragraph does address that, but maybe we can try to make some of this a little clearer. Barbara.
So I guess what I would say is, because these methods provide novel tools to address confounding, not the only tools to address confounding. Now, I'm not sure I like that as well as I thought, but that's what I would say.
Okay, Terry.
I would say I sort of like it the way it is. Getting rid of doing what Corey said initially seems acceptable. I like the paragraph. It was clear to me. I think we're wordsmithing.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we'll move on. Let's paragraph starting on line 31 to 35. Just makes a comment on the causality determinations and the progression. And then we end this response with a short sentence about other material. So, Terry, you're done commenting, right? Okay. I'm going to propose we move on to the next page. Judy, before I do that, Judy has her hand up. Judy, you're muted and your video's off.
Good, but my hands was up.
Yeah, had your hands up, that's right.
Sorry. On lines 37, 38, the last paragraph on page 3.
Yeah.
I would suggest to replace the last sentence. We talk about material and welfare effects in this section is brief and limited to visibility impairment, but this is appropriate given scope of the draft ISA supplement. I would suggest remove that last sentence and replace with recent reviews on environmental and the health impacts of air pollution and the physical science basis of climate change provide background on long visibility effect. I have 4 review articles citing my individual comment. I can add it to there. This reason, because I feel it's not appropriate for us to really comment on the appropriate, non-appropriate, given the scope. And the fact is they should not ignore the non-visibility effect. So this sentence, recent reviews on environmental and health impacts of air pollution and the physical science basis of climate changes provide background on non-visibility effects. Would that be appropriate here?
So you're suggesting that we want to, so section 1, going back and reminding myself, section 1 is the introduction and scope. Is this where this comment would belong, is in the introduction and scope, or would it belong later?
Yeah, I was debating on that, but the issue is for the welfare section, they limited on visibility. Then we say, oh, it is appropriate. I don't agree it is appropriate. So I felt may suggest them add a few references. I mean, they're not going through the thorough review, but some recent review, even 2 of the commentary, volunteer, whatever you said today, public comment mentioned that. And we'll discuss more later today, but I felt somehow this sentence is not really reflect what we say on section 4.
Okay.
Judy, can I speak to Judy's comments?
Yeah.
I think the idea of this sentence was, I mean, well, material effects were discussed in the 2019 ISA, and the conclusion was there was too much uncertainty to make any conclusions. Therefore, this supplemental document spends little time on that because it's a supplement. And I think that was the reason why it focused on visibility, because based on visibility, some recommendations were able to be made for the secondary standard. And so, I mean, I thought that was the scope of the supplement, and it's not that the material effects were being ignored. It's because they were already discussed in the 2019 ISA, and the conclusion was there's too much uncertainty to draw any conclusions on the standards. So I thought that's why that sentence was there. But I don't know if Judy, are you?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
yes, I went back to the ISA 2019. They did a pretty good job there in terms of long visibility effect, but I felt that they should at least add that recent reviews and to acknowledge the welfare is not only visibility. See, so that's why I disagree, says it's appropriate, because they should at least just acknowledge, provide some background, says, hey, we're going to review it. Yes, there are uncertainties, but we are reviewing. We're going to, acknowledge the fact that there are new studies exist, which will help us eventually for the evaluate the long visibility effect.
I think Barbara's next. Jim, you're done, right?
Yes.
I guess I wanted to agree with Judy that there are new studies, but also agree with Jim that I think the treatment of the other effects like climate change is similar to the treatment of other health endpoints in this supplement, right? That we focused on the ones that they determined were already causal in this supplement in terms of the primary standard, and the ones that were already causal, and what additional evidence would there be that would impact the decision-making process on the standard. And so that's appropriate to focus on visibility here for that, essentially that same reason. It's the one that's going to drive the setting of the secondary standard. So I think it's okay. Yeah, I think it's okay as is.
Mark?
Yeah, I guess, and I think that usually the ISAs do not cite reviews. It's really the purpose of the document is to provide the primary evidence. Now that might include meta-analyses, but I would hesitate to suggest adding reviews to the information cited unless there's really a good specific reason to do that. from the discussions I'm hearing, it sounds to me like it's okay. It's reasonable to limit the supplement to visibility impairment based on the 2019 ISA.
George.
Well, as the one who actually wrote that sentence, sorry, Judy, the thinking was along the lines of what Barbara said, and that is that the ISA as a whole is limited to one causal relationships. And I have to go back and look at the table for welfare effects, but I believe visibility was the only one that met that bar. So that's where that came from. That's all it meant.
Actually, George, I think they all met the causal bar, but the conclusion was that climate and welfare were so uncertain that although they were causal, there could be no determination made. So it's a slightly different reason. All three of them, visibility, climate, and materials were all causal, but two of them were so uncertain that that no conclusions could be made. Therefore, they were dropped going into the supplement.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
So maybe we could add a brief comment on that, and then respect, there may be a place, certainly Judy, you could add this to your individual comments. I'm concerned that since this is about the scope of the document, that, I mean, we don't have to agree with it, but this is sort of a new opinion that has emerged in this review. So, yeah, I think we should probably try to stick to what the scope was and argue whether the scope was appropriate. So Jim's clarification might be useful. I wonder if Jim and George can propose a sentence that would address that. And then if if there's any concern we want to express about that judgment, I think we can add that. But I'm not hearing, other than Judy's concern, that there is that.
I think Jim nailed it.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to propose that we move on. The next section is page 4. And it's advice on the process and timeline for CASAC reviews. So Mark sent in advance a comment that maybe we should move it to the top of the section before the charge questions. And so that's something we could discuss. And then a couple of small wordsmithing comments that were both here and in the letter. And I don't know if there's anybody has any other comments about this. Jim.
Yes, I have one comment. Lines 9. Need to make sure. Is it lines 19 to 21? No, that's changed. So lines 16 to 18. I have my edited document, so my lines are all messed up.
Yeah.
The last sentence of the first paragraph. I'm proposing to remove that sentence or have it reworded. And the reason is I don't agree that the panel has a broad depth and breadth of perspectives, since many perspectives are not represented on this panel. In fact, many members of the previous CASAC had perspectives that were vastly different than the perspectives represented by the current panel, including linear no threshold CR functions, associations versus causation, causal biological mechanisms and pathways, co-pollutants and potential confounders, and uncertainty analysis. And so, I mean, I think there are a lot of perspectives that are not represented by this CASAC. And rather than, initially I was going to propose to even put that in there, but to me, I think just dropping the sentence, I don't feel comfortable saying that it covers all perspectives when I know for a fact it doesn't. So that's my proposal, is to drop the last sentence. And if it stays, I would ask that it be reworded.
Okay. Anybody want to comment on that?
I would, I don't really object to dropping that. You could change perspectives to expertise. I think we do have a broader, obviously with addition of the panel, there is a broader expertise available in this review than there was in the previous CASAC. I think the perspectives are certainly perhaps different than they were previously. And there will also always be perspectives that are not representative. So I would favor changing that to expertise, or it'd be okay with me to drop it.
I would be okay with Mark's recommendation as well, changing it to expertise. So either drop it or change perspective to expertise, and either one would be acceptable to me.
Okay, thank you. Terry.
No comment, actually. Mark's already said what I was going to say.
Okay, George?
I agree with the changing perspective to expertise. I think that's appropriate. I also agree, I think it was Mark's suggestion, that this whole paragraph be moved above before the charge question, because it is kind of an overarching piece that is somewhat separate from the charge question.
Okay. Thank you. We'll move that then. Mark, did you have something more you wanted to say?
Yeah, just I was intrigued by John Bachman's public comments about his concern that maybe the way that these paragraphs are constructed would tend to take away from the validity of our review and of the rulemaking process here. And so I would favor some wordsmithing or addition of a sentence to clarify that.
Yes, I would agree with you. I was about to go there, but Corey, were you going to address that topic as well?
No, actually, I was just going to say the sentence says broad depth and breadth. So I think we should strike the word broad.
Okay.
But that's all.
Okay, so addressing Bachman's comments and Mark's comments, I was proposing that we add as a separate paragraph after the paragraph that ends on line 30. I was proposing that we add a sentence that says, or maybe it needs to be wordsmithed a little bit, but in spite of the compressed time frame for this review, CASAC is confident that it was able to appropriately complete its task, actually 2 sentences. Once EPA addresses CASAC's comments, the final ISA supplement and policy assessment deserve the administrator's full consideration and are adequate for rulemaking. So I see a couple of heads shaking yes.
Sounds good.
Okay, well then we'll add that.
I would support that too.
Yes, and thank you to EPN for alerting us to this. We certainly don't want to be misleading or providing misleading advice. So moving on, I think we're going to move into section 2. And section 2, our text is on page 5, lines 5 through 20, 2 paragraphs there. Any comments or proposed edits to that? Hearing none. I'm wondering if we want to take a brief 3-minute break before we move on to section 3, which is pretty long. So I have 10:22. We'll come back at 10:25. Okay. Very brief break. When folks are back, we can take down the posting. Thank you. So moving on to section 3, which is page 5, part A, which is about the identification, evaluation, characterization of the available scientific evidence. This actually goes on fairly long, starts on line 31 of page 5 and ends at line 6 of page 7. Maybe we want to start with just going through what we have on page 5. Is there any comments on that? Those are the 2 paragraphs, overall judgment and the text on causal modeling methods. Mark.
Yeah, so I'm actually not sure where I should make this comment, where this is the right place, but something that I forget what all the rules are for what needs to be stated when and where, but I did put into, hold on, I have to move rooms. I had put into written comments that it struck me that there's not a place where there's a lot of emphasis, important emphasis on studies that are below the current limits of regulation. And those are kind of spread out throughout the whole document. And so I don't know whether I need to voice this, but it was in my comment that it struck me, and I don't know whether because of the time frame of this, EPA can't do it, but certainly for future ones, if not this one, that a kind of section that would summarize those studies, they seem particularly important given what we're talking about, and they're kind of spread out all over as opposed to being in one place where the studies that focus below the current standards, what they are saying. So again, I wasn't quite sure where that necessarily should go in this discussion of section 3, but wanted to get it out there.
Well, it seems like it makes sense to go somewhere in, because you're thinking this is relevant to the identification, evaluation, and characterization of the evidence. So maybe there's some additional specific comments, bullet points at the end. Maybe you want to propose a bullet point that we could add, and maybe while we're discussing, if you could craft that to summarize that point, then we could add it when we get a little bit further along.
Sure.
Barbara.
I just wasn't really clear. Did you mean for future reviews or this review?
Well, I mean, I would say for this review, I don't know whether the timing is such they can do that, but I think it would be extremely helpful.
I would recommend just to not burden EPA too much, since this might be a wholesale revamping of the document, that maybe you use the word suggest for this review so that they can use their judgment about whether they can actually manage to make that change or to otherwise accommodate it.
Sure.
And that way it's clear both that it's about the current review, but that there's a workload consideration that we respect by using the word suggest instead of recommend.
Okay.
Other comments on the text on page 5, that includes some text on causal modeling and where we talk about this causal. I haven't had a chance to reread it after our just completed discussion in the last hour, but want to make sure that others on the panel think that, again, that we've talked about it appropriate, that the point we were making earlier, that causal carries this implication. So that's actually addressed very directly in this paragraph. So I think Hopefully that's adequate. I'm not seeing any hands up. I'm going to suggest we move on to page 6, the paragraph that starts on, Jennifer, are you ready for the next thing? Is that what your hand's up for?
No, it was actually on page 5. I was just slow to get my hand up there. I do want to note that on line 42 on page 5, it does call those methods more novel causal inference analysis methods. So we may want to be consistent there with what was proposed earlier.
Okay. Thank you for calling that out. We'll make sure that we get those words consistent throughout the document. Corey?
No, never mind.
Okay. So now moving on to page 6, line 1 through 18. Any comments on that? I noticed something this morning in looking into what Jason Sachs said about statistical significance, that in summarizing this paragraph, somehow the word statistical significance is in the letter, but is not in this paragraph. I'm not quite sure how that happened. I flagged it for when we get to the letter, but I don't know if there's anything to do here. My other question is whether we had quite a bit of discussion about environmental justice at the meeting, and we don't talk much about it in our consensus responses, other than we mention it on line 18. I just throw that out there in case there's anybody else has any thoughts that we should add something about that.
Maybe we could add a, I don't know exactly what the right word is, but to not just the issue of environmental justice, but the important, the critical issue of environmental justice, something to that effect. I'm not trying to wordsmith, but I just think we could elevate it a bit.
Okay. So maybe add relates to the critically important issue of environmental justice.
That's what I was thinking. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's a small fix that at least emphasizes it. Michael?
Yes, this is just minor, but I think on line 12, where we use et cetera, I don't think that should really be in the document, either expanded or just in the sentence.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And I think we've gotten some comments from somebody on that, so we will, yes, yeah, we'll get that, we'll fix that. We got that from Mark already. Thank you to both of you. Christina.
Yeah, so with regards to that sentence on 17 to 18 about environmental justice, it would make sense if we could clarify it or specify it a little bit, because environmental justice is just as a general term, may not have as much power to it. And I think in this section we're talking about maybe specifically listing disproportionate burdens or disproportionate exposures. I know that later on we talk more about susceptible populations, but we may want to specify that here.
Okay, you have any, maybe you want to think about it. I'll move on to see what Jane has to say. If you've got some specific suggestions here.
Well, you can go on to Jane. And maybe I'll
So my comment is related, and it's indicated in the prior sentence, but I don't find the phrasing exactly as clear as it could be. I think what we might want to say here is that the issue of environmental justice includes issues of both disproportionate exposure and disproportionate susceptibility. And distinguishing those two is really key. I think I stumbled on the sentence prior, which I think sets up our reference to environmental justice, because we say the discussion of heterogeneity of effect estimates largely focuses on variation in particulate matter itself. So there's an issue of composition, again, different from differential exposure or differential exposure to higher or lower PM, distinct again from differential susceptibility. So I think what we want to say is that environmental justice includes these multiple components, and keeping those distinct and clear both in the research and in how we're presenting it here is key.
Thank you. Christina, do you have your hand up again, or you?
I just didn't take it down, but I do have something else to say. I'm just thinking in regards to what Jane was saying, perhaps moving that last sentence up to right before the discussion of heterogeneity of effect estimates, because that really provides some of the clarification that I was just talking about. So maybe moving that up and then distinguish between the disproportionate exposures and then susceptibility as well after that.
Okay. Thank you. Where are we? Barbara, I think, not, Jane, your hand's still up? Yeah.
So I guess I've been learning that across our fields, people use the words vulnerability and susceptibility differently. And that perhaps we include these factors such as exposure and differential response if we would use words like disproportionate health vulnerabilities due to internal and external factors. So I just wanted to put that out there as a, that includes exposure and genetic factors and all kinds of things, right? Differences in composition. So it's an option.
Just a comment on that comment, just thinking back to the 2019 ISA, I remember there was a section in that talked about this vulnerability, susceptibility terminology, and they specifically decided to get rid of those and just use at-risk populations, at-risk individuals, which I thought made sense, and maybe we could stick with that as well.
Okay, John.
I just wanted to go prior to 2019, back when John Samet was chair of CASAC, he also eschewed the distinguishing vulnerability from susceptibility, just thought it caused too much confusion. So it goes way back actually in CASAC discussions.
Jane?
So vulnerability, as was previously defined by EPA, included but was not limited to differential exposures, whereas susceptibility was about differences in effect. So I think the term vulnerability, I would absolutely avoid when we can just say exposure. The term susceptibility still works, or speaking to differences in effect still works. At risk, I personally still find it to be a little bit too vague and to include aspects of both. So I would suggest we avoid that term unless we have different guidance from EPA on specifically what terms they would like us to use in this case.
Okay, well, I'm hearing that we'll maybe just use differential exposure and effects is what or disproportionate, is what I'm hearing. Corey.
Can someone help me? I thought there was another part in our comments where we talked about differential exposure, but is this it? Is this the paragraph to address this? Have I thought there was, and now I can't find it. So can anyone point towards another part of our document where we do discuss differential exposure?
Vulnerability
It may
comes
not be
up
there.
on the next page.
Yeah, on the next page under, C is where we talk about
And I think
socioeconomic status and race.
And 2 paragraphs down.
And I think the point here, and maybe this is enough discussion and we'll just see how to improve it. I may iterate with people a little bit, was just to make sure we had more emphasis on environmental justice. And so I think that's the point here, and some of the wording changes, which I'm hoping that people help me catch up on later as needed, will get incorporated into what we've said, and we'll address that it's consistent with the rest of the document. So, and hearing nothing, well, I'm suggesting we move on now to lines 20 to 21, which actually is just one sentence, and I got a suggestion that maybe we either expand it or drop it. I don't know if anybody has any comments on that. I'm assuming, Jane, your hand is left over. Is any objection to dropping that sentence?
I would object. I think it should be there.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say I think it should be there too.
Okay. Let's see. So how do we explain? Thank you, Mark. I was about to put you on the spot, but now I don't have to.
Yeah, I was kind of the one that raised the question. The thing that caused me confusion when I read this, first of all, was it wasn't clear to me what was meant by these overall scientific findings. And then it says, i.e. concentration response functions, which is a pretty specific finding. So, so that caused confusion, but then also, it says publication bias should be acknowledged. So what does that mean? I mean, yeah, there is publication bias, but I think what are we asking them, is there a problem with the document in terms of its interpretation based on the presence of publication bias? Are we saying that it's ignored in the document and that there is a problem with publication bias in the way that, so I think if we're going to include this, we need to put some more meat on it and some more specificity.
Thank you. Mark.
Yeah, I guess my point was sort of similar to that one, which is that, I'm all for keeping something like this, but it is a little confusing to me. I mean, are we saying publication bias in general should be acknowledged, or that there's a possibility that in some of these findings, there's a possibility that publication bias would have affected what we saw? So I mean, often publication bias isn't something is there. It's something that's possible because we don't know of all the stuff that wasn't published because of something. But are we suggesting that this is something that may influence? And if so, how do we know it doesn't explain the findings? I guess it does seem to need to be more fleshed out in my mind.
Deborah, gonna solve our problem now, hopefully.
Well, I think just acknowledge the potential for publication bias, because otherwise, as Mark was saying, we don't have any quantitative information that can define or not define this, but just say that the potential for publication bias is acknowledged, and kind of leave it at that. We don't know how many studies or what they would have said or not said.
Okay, Jim.
Yeah, I'm just agreeing with others. I'd like to see this section expanded just slightly. And, publication bias may not change the conclusion, but what it does do is add more uncertainty. And it basically will impact maybe how much weight is placed on certain studies and things like that. So I think it's important, because nothing's certain. So it's all about how much weight do you put on different things. So I do think it's important to expand this just slightly to make the point.
Okay. If anybody has any specific wording suggestions, I welcome them. Otherwise, we'll try to figure it out after the fact. Christina.
I don't have any specific wording suggestions. I just wanted to note that for me with reading this, if we're going to mention that, I think it needs to be expanded in terms of a document like this. Just mentioning it brings up doubt about the findings. So I think it would need to be explored more in terms of if there may be a possibility for it impacting the results. And I don't think any of us think that there has been impact from publication bias in terms of invalidating our conclusions. So I think we should make that clear.
David.
Just to keep it, following up on Christina's point there, I think that, just instead of saying findings again, we're more talking about do they impact the conclusions made from this? And I think that's what you're trying to do. The conclusions inference, are there major impacts on those? So maybe just change that slight wording, and then I'm fine with what's been suggested.
Okay. Alexandra. Oh, you're muted. No, you're not. Now you're muted. I can't hear you though.
Odd.
Oh, now.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Oh, I was just going to say, would it be worth noting, as with all existing literature reviews, that there's a possibility for publication bias, so that we're expanding that out, not to just this particular review, but all reviews?
Barbara.
I guess I can't see how publication bias would alter the results of the studies we have.
Mark.
Yeah, I guess I was going along the lines of what Barbara was just saying. I mean, I find this a little odd. I mean, publication bias, obviously anything one looks at, one always potentially has to worry about it. I think perhaps the language needs to be something like what Barbara was saying, that this does not change the weight of the evidence demonstrated by the literature we can review, right? Which is all we have to go on.
Maybe that's what we need to add to this sentence. Corey.
I mean, surely there's a literature here on publication bias in systematic reviews. And I wonder if, I was trying to flip through some things and find it, which is probably not a good use of our time right now, but I wonder if just a suggestion that be acknowledged with some citations to appropriate literature, which maybe, we can dig up on the effects of publication bias in systematic reviews, would kind of plant the flag that we think that this needs to be acknowledged as an issue of doing this type of thing, while also stating that, I think we can advocate for the acknowledgement of that without suggesting that it invalidates what we've seen. And by leaning on literature and publication bias and systematic reviews, it might get the job done.
Yeah, well, if you could dig up a little bit of that, that might be helpful to include. Jim.
Again, I don't think it's going to change the results of any of the studies, but in the end, it's a matter of putting all the pieces together and coming to a conclusion on a recommendation. And, it's all about how much weight gets placed on things. So again, it's not about changing a conclusion. It's just, basically framing it that there are uncertainties with these studies. So I just would like to see that brought into it at somehow.
Okay, we'll try to incorporate the wording about uncertainties. Michael, is this the last word on this topic, hopefully?
Yes, I hope. I'm just wondering if we're asking EPA to mention, discuss how they dealt with publication or the potential for publication bias in developing their conclusions. Maybe that, just a sentence or two inserted into the document could at least raise the knowledge that there is this potential, and whether or not they, and how they dealt with it.
Okay, thank you. We have about 10 minutes before our hard stop to switch to the secondary standard discussion. Let's see if we can at least finish part A of section 3. Is there any additional discussion from line 23 on page 6 through line 6 on page 7? I had one thing I wanted to make sure we got right was on line 28, where we recommend updated language, and we touched on this morning in following up with EPA with respect to the current versus future reviews, and making sure that our wording addresses sort of respecting the fact that this document lines up with, although the previous sentence does, if it is, it does say on line 27 to 28, if it is appropriate to deviate from terminology that matches the 2019 ISA. So we suggest starting on line 26, considering different language, and then we recommend updated language, and maybe we just need to kind of combine that together. Maybe people with more expertise on some of this terminology, because we're saying different language on susceptibility, vulnerability, sensitivity, if appropriate, but updated language on race, ethnicity. And is that what we want to be saying? Or maybe we suggest it all should be updated. This is what I'm going to recommend, that we suggest it's all updated if it's appropriate to deviate. Okay, Mark.
Yeah, just I get hung up a little bit on the language of if it is appropriate to deviate. And I know we're trying to give EPA some room here, but I guess the question is, it kind of raises the question, who decides if it's appropriate to deviate?
EPA.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they're the ones that are going to decide, but who decides what is appropriate for them to do? And I guess I would favor taking that out and changing the recommends to suggests.
Yeah, that would work. That would accomplish the same thing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Corey.
I'm fine with what was just suggested. I was going to say, if we felt like we wanted to be more deliberate about it or more forceful about it, we could suggest something, we could recommend something, and then we could, that is, and strike the if appropriate clause. So we suggest what we want and we recommend what we want, and then we acknowledge that EPA has to align language with all kinds of other EPA documentation. That is, be specific about the issue that we kind of have to defer to the EPA on, but still get the chance to make our suggestion and recommendation unencumbered by what constraints EPA has.
Okay, so that's a different take. So that would keep the suggest and the recommend language and then add a sentence that basically says, we acknowledge that EPA needs to align language across documents and within the agency, and that should be taken into account, something like that. So that would be add a sentence. Christina.
So, yeah, these two sentences are related. I definitely would like to keep that as recommends for the second sentence. CASAC recommends updated language for discussions of race, ethnicity, and as Stephanie mentioned earlier, it can be an opportunity to do that would be to just discuss that up front. Since it seems to be, at least to me, the time to make a change such as this, and to do it now for this particular document. For the previous sentence, I think it also might be helpful to specifically, if we agree on a consensus for what terminology could be, then we make that suggestion. And then perhaps that could also be a recommendation as well, to specifically use these other categorizations. But that'll be up for a little more discussion right now. But I would be fine with just keeping it at suggest for the previous one, even though at risk is not my preferred term, but I would be okay with leaving that as suggest in the second with recommends.
Okay. Let's see, where are we, Jane?
Yeah, so substantively, these are two different issues because the language around susceptibility, vulnerability, sensitivity, that's language that's also used in the risk assessment literature and other work by EPA in considering cumulative risk. And they're technical terms that EPA has tried to define and use consistently in how they describe different studies. But this paragraph is really about respectful and appropriate and modern understandings of race, ethnicity, and how we should be talking about these constructs in the US. So the sentence about susceptibility, vulnerability, and sensitivity, to my read, almost doesn't technically belong in this paragraph. Mm-hmm. Race and ethnicity are one aspect of susceptibility, but not all. And I think it would be okay for us to have a different recommendation or a different strength in our recommendation / suggestion on terms that have already been scientifically defined or attempted to be scientifically defined by EPA versus culturally appropriate terminology. Yeah.
Okay. I'm looking at the time. Let's see if we can wrap up this part A. Terry.
Yeah, just real quick, I like Jane's suggestion on that one sentence deleting it, because to ask EPA, who's trying to be new, to use the terms vulnerability, susceptibility across many documents, for us to ask them to specifically change it for this one document, I think that's asking too much. To ask them to consider it to change their definitions in the future in general is one thing, but I think deleting the sentence will solve a problem.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I like that as well.
Okay. David.
I had a point more on lines 41 to 42 if we can move on to that.
I'm okay with that, yeah.
Okay, so it says the difference between what is considered short-term and long-term exposure also needs to be highlighted. More minor point, but just we need to be very specific. What are we specifically telling them to do? Are we telling them to do this in section 2.1, or are we asking them to do that in other sections of it? So that's just a minor clarification, though, that some wording changes.
Okay, anyone knows, please share that so we can get that right in the final version. You can send me an email and Aaron about that. Otherwise, we'll try to dig it up after the fact. Christina.
So I just wanted to make a comment on the suggestion to remove the sentence about the susceptibility and vulnerability. I think that's fine, and it does make sense to take it out of this paragraph, but I think it might be good to include it as a suggestion somewhere else. So that's my comment.
Okay. Okay, Jane?
I will support what Christina just said. I was going to suggest the same. So that sentence could be moved up to where we had our prior discussion on susceptibility versus vulnerability. My usual suggestion is that we drop the term vulnerability altogether. But if we want to be that specific about it, I don't know. I do want to flag something on lines 40 and 41 that I do hope that we'll talk about.
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm uncomfortable with the statement race is not a necessary component of vulnerability. It is a very important one. It is not.
Wait a minute. That's not line 40 and 41, is it? Well, if you're editing your document.
It's on page, that's on page 7. I think we're still on page 6.
Oh, my apologies. I thought we were moving into page 7 now. I apologize.
The top of page 7 only. It looks like, given the time, we're going to have to start at the top of page 7, part B, next meeting. And it's sure a good thing, given how slow we're going, that we have 3 meetings for this. I see Steve Dutton has his hand up. So before we transition to the PA secondary standard discussion, I'll invite him to make a comment.
Thank you, and this will be very quick. I didn't want to slow down the conversation, but going back to the discussion about publication bias, I'll just point out we do have a paragraph in the preamble to the ISA. It's at the bottom of page 14, which kind of talks about how in general we address or acknowledge publication bias.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think we said we'd give a full hour for the policy assessment secondary standards. So I'm going to invite the meeting administrator to post the charge question for the policy assessment. So just to get us all change our heads around to a new topic, this is reconsideration of the secondary standards for PM. Chapter 5 summarizes key aspects of the welfare effects evidence that are particularly relevant to considering the adequacy of the current secondary PM standards. Chapter 5 also summarizes the quantitative assessment of visibility impairment to inform preliminary conclusions on the secondary PM standards. Chapter 3 presents the preliminary conclusion that the available evidence does not call into question the adequacy of the public health welfare protection provided by the current secondary PM standards, and that it is appropriate to consider retaining these standards in this reconsideration. Chapter 5 also identifies key areas for additional research and data collection in order to inform future reviews. So that was a summary, and then I think there's a bunch of questions now. To what extent does Chapter 5 capture and appropriately characterize the key aspects of the evidence assessed and integrated in the 2019 ISA and the draft ISA supplement on PM-related visibility effects? Number 2, to what extent does Chapter 5 capture and appropriately characterize the key aspects of the evidence assessed and integrated into the 2019 ISA on PM-related climate effects? Number 3, to what extent does Chapter 5 capture and appropriately characterize the key aspects of the evidence assessed and integrated in the 2019 ISA on PM-related materials effect? 4, what are the panel's views on the interpretation of the evidence for PM-related welfare effects for the purpose of evaluating the adequacy of the current secondary PM standards? Specifically, to what extent is the consideration of the evidence, including uncertainties, technically sound and clearly communicated? Number 5, what are the panel's views on conclusions regarding support for new or updated quantitative analyses? What are the panel's views on the technical approach taken to conduct updated analyses to inform our understanding of the relationship between PM and ambient air and visibility impairment? 6, what are the panel's views on preliminary conclusions regarding the adequacy of the current secondary PM standards and on the public welfare policy judgments that support those preliminary conclusions? Does the discussion provide an appropriate and sufficient rationale to support the preliminary conclusion that is appropriate to consider retaining the current secondary PM standards without revision in this consideration? And 7, what are the panel's views on the areas for additional research that are identified in Chapter 5? And there are additional areas that should be highlighted. And with that, I will turn it over to Judy to start out the discussion and responding to all of that. And this is to update what we've done so far.
Thank you. Remember last time we kind of ran short during the meeting, and one issue comes up is that the adequacy of the 24-hour and the annual secondary PM standard. So I was wondering if the committee had a chance to take a look of the, maybe the end, should they put on this Chapter 5 summary there for discussion, or should we just open the discussion?
Oh, you mean what we written?
Right. Leah and I thought there's several things we might like to have additional discussion. I think the focus, the two area, one is the way EPA, so kind of lack of clarity in terms of determining a target of 30 decibel. That's the highest level of a visibility impairment, instead of using the 20 to 25 level. So that's one area deserves some discussion. The other one is because in the report, we say that if a value of 25 decibel or lower is deemed appropriate visibility target level, then the current secondary 24-hour PM2.8 standard of 35 microgram cubic meter may call into question. We made it pretty vague, although Jim has a very good analysis on our table there, showing that 20, maybe the lower end, the 20 or 25 decibel is more appropriate. If you take a look of 30 decibel related to the 35 microgram cubic meter, and if we lower than to the 25 decibel, 25 microgram, that's some of the suggestion, that will proportionally to 21 decibel. So that's actually in line with all the discussion in terms of lower the 24-hour standard from 35 maybe to 25, but so I calculated that would be around 21 decibel. So it's a lower end of 20 to 25. And with respect to the annual standard, because the visibility analysis is based on the 3-year average of 90% higher of daily light extinction. So to evidence to support 15, currently is 15 microgram cubic meter annual secondary standard needs to be warrants further discussion. So another thing we'd like to discuss is I think George Allen suggested follow the precedency of the ozone, NO2 and lead standards. So just set the annual secondary PM 2.5 standard equal to the primary PM 2.5 standard, whatever 8 or 10 microgram cubic meter we end up with. So I wonder if those are the two key issues I think we like to have additional discussion, maybe make additional modification of our summary report currently in chapter 5.
Thank you, Judy. Shall we move to George and see if he wants to add to this opening statement by Judy?
Sure. First of all, thanks, Judy. You did pretty good write-up considering our very limited discussion back in December. I agree that we did not, as I recall, we did not have much, if any, chance to discuss what we thought of potential ranges expressed in deciviews. I guess they would be alternatives since the current secondary NACS is equal to the sort of equal to the primary, but in some cases even more higher. I agree, Judy, with your comment about 30 deciviews is a little not very useful. You say here that it needs to be justified and in terms of the preference studies from table 2, and I absolutely agree with that. I think a range of 20 to 25, or as we say in this business, 25 to 20 deciviews is more appropriate. As you can see in my little background picture, I can see I have a nice visual range target of 10 to 12 miles from the back of my house. With Boston.
Nice view.
It is a nice view. And at 30 deciviews, that's basically gone. And it's only 10 to 12 miles away. And yeah, I missed. So that provides, a context. I mean, visibility is a tough metric because if I didn't have that view and I only saw, half a mile across town, it wouldn't bother me. But I do have that view, and I like that view. I pay for that view basically, so there is some damage when I can't see it. So I think a range of 25 to 20 would be more appropriate than the 30. I believe the last PM review going back, actually one before to 2010, I think the CASAC letter, I think there they did recommend 30 to 20. But I think here, we're saying, well, maybe 25 to 20 is more appropriate. And yes, if we get down to 25 to 20, that certainly does call into question the current secondary 24-hour PM standard, which is equal to the primary 24 of 35. So it starts to become insufficient. And yes, on page 22, Judy, of the letter, you note that maybe it would be appropriate to set an annual secondary equal to the primary, which in this case is on the order of 10, and I would certainly support that. So other than that, you have my usual grumpy comments about whether EPA is going to seriously consider a separate secondary welfare effect standard. We haven't seen it yet, and I think, as I said last time, if we can't get it for ozone, there's a very clear, robust need for a distinct separate secondary standard. I remain unconvinced that EPA is going to seriously consider it for PM either. Historically, what the agency has done is I think they decide, well, we're going to set it equal to the primary, and then they put together what is often a very tortured rationale for why that is adequate and why it's adequate enough that they can ignore CASAC's recommendations, which certainly was the case in the 2012 PM revisions. So unfortunately, I expect to see the same this time around. Unless the agency can say that they've had a change of heart and they're willing to take this secondaries seriously. And since there's a lot of folks here that are relatively new to this process, I want to point out there's a quirk to the secondary standard implementation. Now, we don't talk about implementation here, at least we're not supposed to, but I think it's important to note that unlike a primary NAAQS where there is a requirement to come into compliance with an NAAQS within X years, and for states to write implementation plans, SIPs, to go there in that appropriate regulatory timeframe as outlined in the Clean Air Act. There is no such timeline for compliance with secondary welfare standards in the Clean Air Act. It's just not there. You have essentially forever to come into compliance. There's no implementation hammer. You could argue there's no need for implementation since you have forever. So, that makes me wonder why EPA is sort of reluctant to move forward with at least saying, yeah, it's different, and yeah, this is an objective, and and then you're basically leaving it that, because states don't have to do anything to get there. But at least it would be a statement acknowledging that there are issues here. They're different than the primary. So that's a huge other topic, but I wanted to get that out there, in part to express my longstanding frustration with the agency's unwillingness to go there. And I don't know if they want to comment as to why that's been the case and whether that's going to change in this PM review, or perhaps more importantly, the upcoming ozone reconsideration, on which that panel was actually just named yesterday. So I'll put that on the table for discussion and comment.
Thank you, George. Did you want to say something, Judy?
No. That's good.
Jim Boylan, you're up next.
All right, thank you. I guess I'll reiterate a couple of things. And the first is the selection of the 30 deciviews. We definitely want to see some justification. And I wonder if we could, since EPA is on the call, if we could ask them to explain how they came to the 30 based on the figure in the document, figure 5-2, and maybe they could help us understand why they think 30 is appropriate based on this figure. So I don't know if we can ask them that. If we can, I'd like to hear that. I also would like to ask them about the secondary standard, or the annual standard of 15 micrograms per cubic meter. As far as visibility goes, they include comparisons and analysis looking at the 98th percentile of the daily concentrations averaged over 3 years. So basically 24-hour design values versus visibility metrics of 90 percentile of daily light extinction. And so they basically come up with a justification of why the daily standard relates to visibility and why it's appropriate, and their justification for 35. But I saw zero justification of the annual standard of 15. It's not even mentioned. And so I guess one question is, did the 15 come from ecological effects, or where did the 15 even come from? And I'm not in favor of lowering a standard just to make it consistent. I want to see evidence why it should be lowered, if it should be lowered. But if there's no reason to have an annual secondary standard, and then I think it should just be removed altogether. So I don't know if we can ask EPA those two questions, and they might have to, but I'd just like to hear if they have thoughts on those two questions.
So Erika or one of your staff, or is this a good time for you all to answer Jim's questions?
Yes, we'd be happy to try. And I'm going to ask Nicole Hagan, who is our lead on the secondary standards, if she wants to address those, maybe in turn. Nicole, are you on?
And if it's
yes, Erika, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. So with regard to the first question, which is about the level of 30 deciviews that is explored as a part of the policy assessment, I will note that 30 deciviews, as all of you have suggested in the discussion today, is the upper end of the range that was identified in the 2012 review. And in that review, we had a number of public preference studies that evaluated the acceptable levels of visibility. And from those studies, we were able to derive a range of 20 to 30 deciviews, which was the range that was proposed in the 2020 review. Since that time, we do not have any additional public preference studies that could further inform a different range or the selection of a different target level from that range based on the information that we have in front of us from the science. And so maybe I'll just pause and see if anybody has further questions about the deciview part.
Well, this is Jim. So I agree with the range of 20 to 30, but it looks like the analysis picked the value of 30 as the highest value. And I guess I'm trying to understand why the highest value is appropriate versus the average value or even the lowest value, and why the highest value, because when you look at the highest value, the overall acceptability across all the locations that were analyzed is well below 50%. In fact, there's some areas that are sitting at 7% and 3% and 8% acceptability when you use 30. So I guess would like to understand why the highest value rather than the middle value or the low value was selected.
And Alexandra, did you want to chime in before we go back to EPA?
Yeah, because this is for Nicole and my earphones broke. So can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Everything's fine. So in my reading of the chapter, I found some wording about the limitations of the visibility preference studies being the motivation for keeping it at the upper end of the range. I don't know if we agree with that, but I just wanted to ask Nicole if that was one of the primary motivators for choosing 30 decibels.
That's a great question. And there are a number of uncertainties that we identify in the policy assessment associated with using public preferences to inform that target level of protection for visibility. I think that primarily we followed an approach that was consistent with what was done in the 2012 rulemaking. And in that rulemaking, the analysis that was conducted in comparing that target level of protection in terms of a visibility metric to the 24-hour PM 2.5 standard was conducted at a level of 30 deciviews. And as I said, in this review, we didn't have any additional information that would suggest that we should select a different value within that range. Clearly, you all are suggesting that maybe we should consider something other than the upper end of that range. And, that's definitely something that is being posed in the charge questions related to the technical analysis for visibility.
Yes, that's correct. And I guess I would also say, if you feel strongly about the 30, it would be nice to have that justification put into the document, stating why 30 is appropriate, to use, because I just didn't see that justification in there.
Okay, I think did you want to address the second question now, Nicole?
Sure. So Jim's second question was related to why we focus on the 24-hour PM 2.5 standard rather than focusing on either the annual PM 2.5 or the 24-hour PM 10 standards. And I will first note that there is a description in Chapter 5 of the policy assessment that notes that we do emphasize the 24-hour PM 2.5 standard because those the evidence that we have suggests that the fine fraction of PM is the fraction that contributes the most to light extinction. And so it would be the greatest input to the improved equations for estimating light extinction. I will note that in this policy assessment and the quantitative analysis that we conducted, we did have the coarse fraction available for all of the locations that were included in our quantitative assessment. We did not have that data in the 2020 policy assessment, and we did not have the course fraction in the 2012 review. So that is one improvement where we are focusing more on the course fraction as an input to the equations. However, we also note that 24 hours is a time period that's more closely related to when people would experience visibility impairment. So people are more likely to experience visibility impairment and the effects of that impairment on a daily basis rather than on an annual basis. So it's more of a short-term effect in terms of how people experience visibility impairment as opposed to an annual effect. And I will note that the annual standard, while we don't give it a lot of emphasis in the secondary chapter, that's a standard that was set in past reviews when we also considered the ecological effects of PM as a part of the PM NAAQS review. As you may know, we are considering the ecological effects of PM as a part of the ongoing oxides of nitrogen, oxides of sulfur, and particulate matter ecological effects review. So, that more long-term standard and the effects that are associated with it would likely be covered in more depth in that review.
So, yeah, and I wasn't asking about the PM 10 standard, but I agree with everything you said with PM 2.5 and the daily standard is appropriate. And right, my comment was more about where did, basically I saw no discussion of the annual secondary standard in this chapter. And what you just talked about is the 15 micrograms came from the ecological evaluation. I think that maybe our comment should be that discussion needs to be put in this chapter, because you read this and there's no justification at all in this chapter on 15 micrograms. So I just think it needs to be discussed. And if it's based on ecological effects, which is in a different review, then that just needs to be stated in there. So I think our comments might, I think we asked for additional discussion, and I think that's what we'd probably be looking for. Okay, that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Nicole. So Alexandra, did you have further comments?
Yeah, so I did want to say, just for reference, it's on page 5.9, the justification for the target level of protection. But when I was rereading this section, I realized, I did have one question, which is, it seems like the acceptability studies use 50% as a cutoff. So if you have a minimum of 50% or more people who judge something as acceptable, then it's acceptable. And I guess I have that might be more of a question of whether or not that's sufficient to characterize public welfare. And maybe that can't be incorporated into this assessment, but I think that's kind of an interesting point. And I think when I was reviewing this, I realized that both the preference studies have a lot of limitations, and the analysis, the comparisons of the standard and the light extinction numbers. So I guess it's kind of a question of, if we think we should reconsider the standard, is which limitations we think are greater. So the visibility studies have all the public preference studies have all the issues of methodology, and there's not that many, and who's participated as a representative and so forth, which is why it seems like EPA opted for a conservative target level. But then when we look at the quantitative analysis of the comparison of the standard with the light extinction estimates, we know that the equation matters. We know that coarse particulates matter for some regions that were not well represented in that analysis. And then we know that there's stuff that's not being characterized, let's say like microplastics. So there are limitations with that analysis as well. And so in my mind, it's really which set of limitations is greater in terms of what we end up deciding. And thinking about it, I think I kind of came to the conclusion that I'm not convinced that the public preference studies, that there's enough of them right now, at least, to I would advocate, yes, that the existing studies show 25, let's say, deciviews as more appropriate as a target level, but I don't know if there's enough science right now to use that as a consideration for reconsidering the secondary standard, if that makes sense. So I tend to fall on the side of the limitations of public preference studies being greater than the limitations of the light extinction data. I hope that was clear.
Thank you. George, did you want to respond to something Alexandra said before we move on to Barbara?
Well, I just wanted to loop back to the previous topic of 15. I think where that number originally came from was the annual standard set in the late 90s and retained in 2006. That was 15. That's where the number came from. Whether, the justification for keeping it when the annual was changed to 12 in the subsequent review, that's a different discussion. But as far as where the origin of the number, I'm pretty sure that's where it came from. But I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. Barbara, you're also up next. I don't know if there's, and I see Alexandra has her hand up. I don't know if there's some discussion we want to have before you add your comments.
Alexandra, did you have something more to say on that?
Oh, just that I agree with Jim 100% on adding some discussion of the justification of 15 for the annual, because that is not in chapter 5. So I just wanted to support that.
Okay, so, I know we talked about all this when we met last, but it was late in the day. So I feel like it is worth just hitting those points again in this meeting. And I agree probably with what most people have said. I didn't read what the justification for the annual secondary standard was. I didn't read it in the document, and I don't know what it is, but if it's a good idea for EPA to clarify that. It seems from the standpoint of visibility, it's the 24-hour standard that really matters. And, largely, I think the EPA did a good job of describing what we know from the standpoint of visibility and PM 2.5. And so my major response would be around the question of, can we conclude that the secondary 24-hour standard is adequate? And I think, no, we can't conclude confidently that it's adequate. I'm not sure that means we know what it should be, but I think we can conclude absolutely that there's a causal relationship between PM 2.5 and visibility, and they say that, and I agree. And that at least in the western half of the United States, based on the preference studies, it looks to be that there's less than 50% acceptability at 30 deciviews. And so it's true that's not new evidence, and it's also true that there should be more studies done. It looks to be that if you live in the western states, that 20 to 25 deciviews hits that 50% acceptability better, and that it also appears that that's consistent with 25 microgram per cubic meter level. So I think I would say that that the existing data calls into question the adequacy of the current standard. Not that it necessarily tells us what the current standard should be for PM 2.5 24-hour secondary standard. And then to get down to the text, I think that Judy did a great job of writing that paragraph about the 24-hour standard. I agree with what she says, and I think it's not saying what the standard should be, but it does make those points that we can't conclude based on the current evidence that the current 24-hour standard is adequate.
Okay. Thank you. Is there further discussion by anyone? Jim?
I guess I'll just follow up on what Barbara just said after, I'm reading through the section on page 5.9 that I must have missed, but I think Barbara said we can't, Barbara, can you repeat your last thing about the adequacy of the standard?
We cannot conclude that the current secondary 24-hour standard is adequate.
Okay, but can we also?
The current data calls into question the secondary 24-hour standard.
Okay, but we can't conclude that it's inadequate as well. Would you agree with that? I agree that it calls it into question. I don't think, to me now, after looking at it, that it's clear with so few studies and such high uncertainties that it's, to me, not clear whether it's adequate or not adequate.
Yeah, I think usually when I think about these, I think about them in two steps, right? So I'd say that the current data calls into question the adequacy of the current standard. The next step would be, then you try and look to see, is there a different value that is more appropriate? And I don't think we can say that.
But based on Jim's analysis extracted from the list on the table 2-1, that is clearly that should be around, like you say, 20 to 25 decibel, translated to, similar to the level we were thinking for the suggesting for the 24-hour standard, rather than 35. Another issue is for the annual standard, and for the annual secondary PM standard, it would look, it's just, if they lower to 8 to 10, then the visibility retain, like George said, God knows when that was last time set up, it was 15 microgram per minute, seemed to be not really appropriate.
So I guess I would say that based on the data we have, 25 micrograms per cubic meter seems to be more appropriate. Now there's some uncertainty in that number, right?
Yeah.
That there's
That's
a range that we don't know. There's uncertainty in that number, but that seems to be a more appropriate number than 35.
That translates to 21.6 decibel. So 21.4. So it's actually, if it's 25, that seemed to be, I agree with Barbara, that seemed to be really appropriate. And then that's follow what Jim's table there. If we look at 21, it's not too bad. Denver's was 20, and Washington, D.C., one of the study was 20. And then, of course, Canada is lower in terms of the decibel.
So to me, it's not clear cut that, say, the acceptable visibility of 25 was selected.
I know.
It's not clear that, let's say 25 was selected. I mean, I think arguments could still be made that 35 is adequate to protect against a 25 decibel. I think there's evidence out there. I don't think it's clear cut that just because we go to 25 decibels now the secondary standard needs to drop all the way down to 25. I don't see that in the figures. So I think it just needs to be looked at a little more, but I don't know if, even if it was 25, I think a justification could be put together that 35 micrograms is protective of a 25 decibel visibility standard. So I don't think it's clear cut that the standard would necessarily have to be lowered to protect that 25 decibels.
So shall we leave it the way it is? The value of 25 decibel is deemed appropriate visibility target level. Then the current secondary 24-hour PM 2.5 standard 35 microgram may be called into questions. That's why we left it there, kind of, because we, like you say, we cannot conclude confidently that the causal relationship or the adequacy of the 24-hour secondary PM standard. We can just say call into question.
You're, I like how it said may call into question. So I think that's why that language was put in there.
Yeah, no, that's why we say here, maybe call into question.
I agree with everything as written.
Oh, that's good.
It's pretty good, right?
And I guess
I agree with that. I will spend a weekend to fix it.
yeah, I'm actually thinking probably not much or anything needs to change. And if anything does, I guess we can talk about it next week. But I mean, based on the lines of conversations we've had so far, I think most of the write-up probably can just stay as it is.
So yeah, I do want to call your attention that we did add in into a last paragraph, the growing amount of microplastic emissions and presence in airborne particles with potential effect on the Earth's radiation balance, as well as deposition on materials, soils, waterways, merits further research into their concentrations, chemical composition, optical property, and size range. So we did add that paragraph after our consensus report.
And that was
Jim,
more
you agree with that, right?
that was on future research, right?
Yeah, exactly. That was Leah and I discussed it and add that paragraph. That was the changes on the previous.
I don't have any issues with that.
That's great, because Alexandra and I both have the issue about microplastic should be pointed out.
Well, Alexandra, your hand has gone up and down a bunch of times. Should I call on you before the people whose hands are up first?
I just kept doubting whether I should bring this up, but it seems to me, since there was no new additional data, but for one data point, I think, in this supplement on the public preference studies, are we basically saying that we disagree with the previous assessment? And did the previous assessment call into question the secondary standard? I guess that would be in 2020. So I guess to some degree, if they said that they were okay with the standard and it wasn't called into question, and we have but one extra data point, we're basically disagreeing, right, with the previous assessment. I don't know if we need to say that or not, but I think that's what's happening, is that we're looking at the data in a different way.
It's probably a fair conclusion.
Maybe George can speak to the last time, because I wasn't involved last time, but.
No, I think she means the panel, the CASAC you were on just in 2020.
Oh, that one. Okay. Okay, if it's the most recent one, then yes, I guess that I don't even know if there was much discussion on this on the last CASAC. So I think we've had a lot more discussion in this CASAC than the last CASAC.
Yeah, I would agree with Jim. I think it was hardly touched on at all.
And George, in the previous PM standard, did the CASAC, not the one from a year or two ago, but the one before that, didn't they recommend 20 to 25 deciviews?
30 to 20 was.
30 to 20. Okay, so they did 30 to 20.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I went back and looked at that when we in the preparation for this review.
Okay, Barbara, you're next.
I guess if it's just me and I were looking at the data that we have, I would say the appropriate standard would be between 25 and 35. I could say that confidently if it were me. And, we might decide we want to actually say that, but we don't have to.
I think given that we have tried to nail down our recommendations for the primary standard, it would be good to make a statement for the secondary standard as well, which I didn't see specifically in the draft. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to give you all time to actually air your perspectives. So I would actually recommend that we try to say something explicit.
I absolutely agree.
Terry.
It's a minor point, but I can't believe that microplastics add even a fraction to the particle mass that's out there, given all the combustion sources. I mean, I know it's a new hot thing and I'm doing research also, but I think I would tone down the suggestion. It doesn't seem like I guess I'm just predicting it won't be that important.
Right now, it's just a future research recommendation, so I think in that sense, it's harmless.
Okay.
So what's the consensus then? I heard two things. I heard the evidence calls into question the adequacy of the current standard. And I heard that there's not enough evidence to really recommend a new level, and therefore the level would be 25 to 35 micrograms per cubic meter, 24-hour. That's what I heard. And I haven't heard that we have any opinions on the annual other than that EPA should justify it in the document. Is that a good summary of the discussion?
I thought we were going to stick with deciviews rather than concentration. I'm a little confused.
Oh, well, I guess maybe that's my lack of scientific understanding. But I was hearing there was an equivalence between deciviews and concentration. That's where I heard the 25 to 35.
Yeah, there's a loose relationship in there, but EPA in this review, as well as CASAC in the 2010-2012 review, did use deciviews, and I think Judy can comment that I believe that's the preferred metric. But then if you're standard setting and if you're not measuring deciviews or some surrogate like extinction, then you do have to kind of map that to concentration, which maybe Leanne, maybe that's where you're going. But Judy can clarify what term we should use when we make the recommendation. Maybe both, Judy.
Yeah, maybe both, because they eventually have to relate the deciview back to the secondary standard. So shall we modify to a value of 20 to 25 decibel is deemed improper visibility target level protection? Then the current secondary 24-hour PM2.1 standard should be in the range of 25 to 35 micrograms.
So Judy, excuse me, Barbara, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, just that, we could tell them they should set a standard in deciviews, but that would mean measuring deciviews and controlling for deciviews. And I mean, we might choose to do that, and that's not what's been done in the past. So if we're not telling them to do that, then we're translating to micrograms per cubic meter.
And that gets back to, we should maybe stake both units because that translation can be a little fuzzy.
Yeah, that sounds like.
Yeah, that's why everybody agree with the sentence I suggested?
That sounds great to me, Judy.
Judy,
Thank you.
Did you say this? A standard in the range of 25 to 35 micrograms per cubic meter is supported by the available preference studies?
No, I didn't say that. I don't want to say that. Like you say, it's not, we cannot conclude that. Then the current standard, the current secondary 24-hour PM2.1 standard of 25, in the range of 25 to 35 microgram cubic meter should be considered. How's that?
Okay.
Yeah, I like everybody agreed. We knew that 30 decibels is too high, but we don't have enough data, like you said earlier, can conclude confidently the adequacy of that. However, seems like we all agree with 30 is on the upper end of the visibility impairment. And based on Jim's analysis, it's very convincing that level should go down. So that's why I say if a value of 20 to 25 decibel is deemed an appropriate visibility target level of protection, then the current standard of should be considered. We can kind of play with these words a little bit.
All right, I agree with that.
Okay.
Terry, did, oh,
just really quick. I was wondering if there is such a loose link between deciviews and microgram per cubic meter. Why aren't you guys suggesting that we change is it the form? Why aren't we suggesting going to deciviews? Is that too wild of a suggestion?
It's wild.
It is, yeah. Decibel was set up as the logarithms related to how your eye perceives the visibility. And not that everybody agree with that. So, and that's why they translated decibel to the distance, because that's from point A to point B, one can see.
I think there may be a day when we can do that, but I don't think we.
Yeah.
So we need, for visibility, we need to have speciated data. We need sulfate, nitrate. We need it all broken down into the components because they all have different scattering efficiencies. And, you know, going to a species, I mean, basically breaking it, requiring the speciation is really, one, going to limit where you can even do the analysis. And two, it's just going to be a whole new thing. So I at this point, I don't think we're ready to go there.
And there are a lot of benefits of measuring 2.5 in, you know, anyway, right? It's an efficient way to do it, to regulate the standard.
And there's always the option of actually measuring extinction. That was discussed a long time ago. EPA was actually tasked with developing or looking at developing an FRM for extinction. It never went anywhere, but this has come up before. So if you're going to measure something, probably extinction would be the best metric. And then at least you have a good, robust starting point to go on to deciviews, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, I don't think we can go there in this discussion, especially given the time, but, you know, put that aside for next time.
Yeah, it is kind of complicated. Agree. Another area I thought maybe we should need to revise based on the discussion is that the paragraph that considered the annual standard. So I will change to since the visibility analysis was based on 3-year average of the 90th percentile of daily light extinction, rationale to support 50 microgram cubic meter annual secondary standard need to be justified. That be good? Does that reflect what Nicole says ecological effect, but it wasn't anything mentioned. We can't say, we can't mention the ecological based on the ecological effect, but we can just say that they need to, rationale for that need to be justified.
Yeah, I think I clearly heard that there needs to be more text about the justification of the annual standard. In
so would the sentence reflect what do we say? We discussed.
That sounded good to me.
I like to keep that sentence. One alternative is to set the annual secondary standard equal to the primary standard, following the precedence of the ozone, NO2, and lead next. Because that, you know, otherwise we will leave with one is 8 or 10, the other one is 15. It's just so arbitrary anyway.
Well, I might object to that just because I don't think we should lower standards or set standards just based on precedent. You know, I like to lower standards and base standards based on scientific evidence. And so I don't think that, to me, that's not a good reason. Just because we've done it with other pollutants, we should do it with this pollutant. So I would probably recommend removing that sentence.
Then what should we do? We just say we need them to justify it. And then we leave that with 15.
Yeah, I would support that. I'd rather remove the sentence.
Okay.
I mean, it sounds like their justification is going to be this is evaluated in a different, in the ecological effects review, and it's not even relevant to anything we're even looking at in this document. Apparently the 15 came from the ecological effects.
And so then they'll just add that text and then it'll be fine.
Right.
Bottom line, should we, like Jim mentioned earlier, should we just suggest to remove the annual secondary standard?
Well, I mean, based on visibility, it doesn't seem very useful, but for ecological effects, I
That's
think it
true.
might be, I think it might be very, very appropriate. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. Okay, let's just remove that sentence. Okay, those are the two main things we're gonna revise. I will revise and send it out to everybody.
Okay, sounds like this discussion is pretty
Perfect.
well done.
We've got 5 minutes to spare.
Well, we're not going to go back to the ISA with only 5 minutes left, and we probably lost a few people as well. So if you all are done, I think I will invite Aaron to recess our meeting until Monday. And before I do, I just want to say that we will need to be mindful on Monday that we try to move fast enough through the ISA so that we have plenty of time to talk about the PA, because we've had more discussion than I expected on the ISA today, and there were some very important topics we covered, so that was good. But we need to be careful because I think the PA discussion is actually more important, and so we don't want to spend too much time on the ISA and run out of time again. We do have an extra meeting, which I was hoping we could cancel on Friday, but at the rate we're going, it doesn't look like it. But I'm starting to worry that we might run out of time on Friday, which is a different problem. So just asking everybody when we reconvene on Monday that you are mindful of what we need to talk about and what we can maybe do offline. You know, minor changes we can certainly handle offline. Major points of emphasis and things that we need to vet among ourselves, we certainly need to discuss. So try to have that balance as we move forward. So with that, unless there's I don't see anybody with a hand up, so I'm going to invite Aaron to recess us until Monday. Should I ask if EPA has any final comments?
Sure.
Seeing no hands, I'm going to assume they don't for now, and they'll have other opportunities if they do. So go ahead, Aaron.
Okay, so we will be recessed until Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern time. We'll see you all then. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Leanne. Thanks, Judy.
Thank you. Bye.